Hey, guys. It's time to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Roman Colosseum was not designed for sportsmanship. It was designed for spectacle, and also possibly as a way for emperors to avoid doing actual paperwork. Today we have stadiums for soccer. The Romans had stadiums for chaos. If you walked into the Colosseum expecting fairness, you'd be about as disappointed as someone who brought a picnic to a thunderstorm. The crowd wasn't looking for balance. They weren't here to see who fought best. They were here to see who fell best, ideally in the most theatrical way possible. Bonus points for flailing arms and tragic facial expressions. Let's be honest, the Roman definition of entertainment was robust. A perfectly matched fight between two trained gladiators. Sure, that happened. But far more common were the opening acts, criminals, captives, or very unlucky people who happened to owe the wrong senator money. These folks were given the equivalent of a sharp spoon and told to make it dramatic. And dramatically, they made it. The Colosseum wasn't just a stadium, it was a form of civic therapy. Life in ancient Rome could be stressful, plagues, brain shortages, and the occasional fire. Watching someone else have a really, really bad day in a controlled environment was how people coped, and it was free. Funded by the emperor, the games were a very public please-like-me gesture. You got grain, a seat, and a view of someone running from an angry elephant. What more could you want? Even the architecture encouraged inequality. The emperor had the best seat, senators got cushions, and everyone else got a stone bench and sunstroke. The actual people in the arena, they got an audience. So fairness. Not exactly the design priority. This wasn't a fencing match. This was ancient Rome's version of dinner theater. If your dinner included fried dormice, and the play ended in screaming, if you were a participant, you weren't measured by your win-loss ratio. You were measured by how loud the crowd got when you tripped over your own foot and fell directly into a net. Nothing says public service quite like forcing an untrained civilian to fight a heavily armed professional in front of 50,000 strangers. The Romans had a word for this entertainment. And while we have game shows and cooking competitions, they preferred something with slightly more risk and significantly fewer rules. Enter the gladiator versus amateur match, a charming tradition where a trained killer faced off against, say, a baker with a sword, or a bureaucrat with an existential crisis. These weren't just one-off mistakes. These were planned. Sometimes the amateurs were volunteers, sometimes they were condemned criminals, and sometimes they were just guys who really should have read the fine print. Gladiators, contrary to modern movie logic, weren't all enslaved nobodies. Some were volunteers, some were celebrities, and all of them were highly trained. They lived in schools, had coaches, and were basically professional athletes, except with more armor and fewer endorsement deals. Now imagine pitting one of them against someone who learned sword fighting from watching shadows on a wall. The result was predictable, and that was the point. This wasn't about suspense. This was about spectacle. The audience didn't want a fair fight. They wanted to cheer for the obvious winner while pretending the other guy had a shot. It was the ancient Roman version of watching a squirrel try to drive a chariot. And for the amateur, well, they had options. Option 1, survive long enough to be mildly impressive. Option 2, survive long enough for the crowd to feel sorry for you. Option 3, get hit so quickly and dramatically that the audience laughs and the emperor nods in approval if you were particularly charming. What dramatic. You might even earn a reprieve. Romans loved a good underdog story, especially if the underdog was bleeding just the right amount. But most of the time, the outcome was settled before the match began. The crowd knew it. The fighters knew it. Even the guy sweeping the sand probably knew it. Let's say you're accused of a crime in ancient Rome. Maybe you stole something. Maybe you looked at the emperor's statue a little too long. Maybe your neighbor just really doesn't like you. Congratulations, you now qualify for a special appearance in the Colosseum. And by special appearance, we mean you're going to be introduced to a lion up close, personally, and probably without warning. The damnatio ad bestias, or condemnation to the beasts, was a Roman tradition that asked the important question: what if our justice system was also a zoo? It was Rome's solution to everything from theft to treason. Throw the accused into the arena, open a gate, cue the music, and a panic. The lions weren't ordinary cats either. They were imported, often from North Africa, and treated like star performers. They got better transportation than most citizens, and sometimes better food. The prisoner, meanwhile, got a tunic and a vague sense of doom. No armor, no weapon. Occasionally a stick. Because nothing says fairness like handing someone a twig and telling them to make it look exciting. This wasn't a fight, it was a message. The Empire didn't just punish you, it made you part of the show. The more dramatic your final moments, the more the crowd cheered, the more the Emperor smiled, and the more everyone forgot their rent was overdue. And yes, people brought their children. Because why go to the Forum when you could teach your kids valuable life lessons like don't commit fraud or you'll be launched? Sometimes the condemned surprised everyone. They ran, they dodged, they climbed things. There's at least one account of a man playing dead, so convincingly that the lion lost interest. Unfortunately, the crowd didn't. They made sure the show went on. If you're thinking this seems excessive, the Romans would have agreed. But only if you suggested not using lions. That would have ruined the aesthetic. So let's say the lion match is over, and the crowds had their fill of seeing unarmed prisoners make friends with fate. What's next? Naturally, let's arm some people and send them back in, but with more animals and weirder ones. Enter the Venetians, Rome's version of man versus wild. If the wild was extremely annoyed and the man was wearing gladiator sandals. These were staged hunts where specially trained fighters, or let's be honest, whoever was available and didn't owe too many favors, were given weapons and told not to look nervous. The Colosseum would be transformed into a faux wilderness. Fake trees, imported sand, maybe even a bit of shrubbery if someone had the budget. Then wild animals were released. Leopards, bears, ostriches, rhinos, crocodiles. Basically anything that could stomp, charge, or deeply confuse an audience. Fighters were expected to battle them with spears, nets, or in some cases, absolutely nothing helpful. There are stories of men sent in with slings or sticks, which is exactly as effective as yelling "please stop" at a charging order. And here's the twist. It still wasn't a fair fight, just in the opposite direction. Sometimes the animals were sick, drugged, or starved to make things manageable. Other times they were just dumped into chaos, unsure if they were supposed to attack or audition for a tragedy. Not that it mattered. The goal wasn't survival, it was spectacle. Did the crowd care about the animals? Not especially. If a rhino managed to flip a man into the air like a decorative coin, they cheered. If the man somehow won, they cheered louder. There was no losing, just entertainment and occasionally. The animals teamed up. In one account, a bear and a lion supposedly ignored the humans and started fighting each other. The crowd adored it. The organizer probably got promoted. It wasn't hunting. It wasn't combat. It was what happens when an empire gets rich enough to invent new hobbies and bored enough to turn the food chain into improv theater. By now, the Roman Colosseum had established a theme. Take something brutal and somehow make it weirder. But when they wanted to really impress the audience, they dipped into mythology. Because why simply execute someone when you could recreate a legend while doing it? This delightful tradition was known as fatal charades. Not a game, unfortunately, but a form of public execution that merged storytelling with creative sentencing. Picture a condemned man dressed as Icarus, strapped into fake wings and pushed off a platform. No, he didn't fly. No, it wasn't subtle. The Romans loved mythology, gods, heroes, tragic endings. So instead of quietly dealing with criminals, they reimagined their deaths as performances. The audience wasn't just watching justice, they were watching art. Violent, state-funded art. Take the story of Prometheus, for instance. In myth, he's chained to a rock and has a certain recurring eagle problem in the Colosseum. They skipped the rock and used stage props. But the eagle? That part was real. Or Orpheus, the tragic musician who tried to rescue his wife from the underworld. The Roman version. A man in a tunic with a harp walks across the arena, and then someone quietly releases a few large, extremely uninterested animals. It didn't end with music. The crowd, of course, loved it. Finally, culture and entertainment all in one. You could feel refined for recognizing a myth and still point and laugh when the guy in the Apollo wig tripped over his sandals. Were these performances accurate to the original stories? Not remotely. But accuracy wasn't the goal. Spectacle was. If they remembered the plot correctly, great. If not, they just invented a new version where Hercules loses a foot, to be clear. These weren't plays. The performers weren't actors. They were people who'd been sentenced to death and were now expected to help bring a story to life before exiting it in the final act. No curtain call, no applause, just a well-timed nod from the Emperor and a satisfied crowd who now felt a little more cultured, despite the fact that someone had just been Zeus off a scaffold. Just when you think the Colosseum couldn't get more extra, Rome said, what if we made it a lake? Yes, at various points in its early history, the Colosseum hosted mock naval battles called Naumachia. Because when you've already turned executions into theater, the next logical step is to simulate a maritime war in a building that is very much not near the sea. Roman engineers, who clearly had both talent and too much time, figured out how to flood the arena floor, not with symbolism. With actual water, the kind that makes boats float and inexperienced sailors panic. The plan was simple. Fill the floor, toss in a few ships, and stage a battle with real people who are often less informed about rowing than the audience. Sometimes these mock battles reenacted famous sea clashes. Other times it was just teams of captives told to row, fight, and try not to look like you've never seen it or before. And let's talk about those boats. They were smaller than real warships, of course. You try fitting a full fleet into an amphitheater and see how far you get, but they were still decked out with paint, flags, and very real weapons, which meant there was a good chance that someone was going to fall in, be pushed in, or just jump in because it seemed like the better option. The audience watched from above like cruise passengers watching a buffet fire, equal parts confused and delighted. Nobody really cared about naval tactics. They wanted to see if someone fell off the boat in a dramatic way. Bonus points if they screamed something poetic while doing it. And yes, there were moments of drama. Ships colliding, fighters leaping across decks, people accidentally poking their allies with spears. Honestly, it was less naval strategy and more floaty chaos with costumes. Eventually, the Colosseum stopped flooding itself for these shows. Probably because it turns out water and ancient concrete don't make the best long-term couple. But for a while, Romans got their sea battles, their splashing and their laughs, even if half the participants couldn't swim and the other half couldn't steer. Sometimes even staged combat wasn't dramatic enough. That's when the organizers rolled out the party pack, blindfolds, shackles, mismatched weapons, and a general disregard for the laws of physics or common decency. Why? Because fairness is boring. But watching someone try to fight blindfolded? Hilarious for everyone except the person wearing the blindfold. One popular twist was to take a perfectly competent fighter and make their life significantly harder for entertainment's sake. Remove their armor, shorten their weapon, or give them something completely useless like a net. Or worse, a wooden sword. Nothing says good luck quite like stepping into the arena holding what is essentially a stick from a child's toy set. Then there were the shackles. Fighters were sometimes chained by the ankles, wrists, or both. Because clearly, if you've already trained to survive an armed duel in front of thousands, what you really need is to be physically restrained while doing it. Bonus, it makes dodging a lot more interpretive. Some were forced to fight while tied together. Yes, to each other. It was called the three-legged race of doom. Okay, not officially, but it should have been. Imagine trying to survive with someone else's panic dictating your footwork. One stumbles, both fall, and the crowd loses its mind. Of course, these gimmicks weren't used on just anyone. Gladiators were investments. The ones who drew crowds and had reputations were spared the most ridiculous setups, unless the audience was bored and the emperor wanted a laugh. Then all bets were off. And let's not forget the occasional surprise opponent. You think you're fighting one guy, and suddenly a trapdoor opens and out comes a second one. Or even better, something with claws. Imagine a WWE match where the floor randomly spits out a bear. Ancient Rome did that. But sincerely, None of this was in the rule book, mostly because there was no rule book, just a checklist. Is it entertaining? Is it absurd? Can it be cleaned up before the next match? You might assume that the Roman Colosseum, in all its chaotic brilliance, gave its audience a break between events. A moment to stretch, grab some olives, maybe talk about how well the gladiators were accessorized. And technically, yes, there was an intermission, but in true Roman fashion, even that was turned into a performance. Welcome to the Meridiani, the midday break. While the morning had beast hunts and the afternoon promised gladiator duels, lunchtime was reserved for something a little more procedural: public executions, because nothing pairs with your midday bread roll quite like the Empire's idea of due process. These executions weren't spontaneous, they were scheduled, organized, timed with the precision of a stage play. The condemned, usually criminals, deserters, or people who had annoyed the wrong bureaucrat, were brought out for the crowd to see justice being served loudly and without any red tape. No one was expecting drama. This wasn't a fight, it was a warning. Don't be like this guy, the Empire said. Also, please enjoy your olives and the methods well. Let's just say they were creative. Sometimes it was quick, a clean finish, and on with the show. Other times it was needlessly elaborate, especially if the person had made headlines. The Romans believed justice should be efficient, theatrical, and ideally sponsored by someone in a toga. The crowd by this point was used to it. Kids asked for better seats. Merchants hawked snacks. No one blinked. If anything, they got annoyed when it ran long. Come on, someone would mutter. We're just here for the real matches. That's what makes this part so absurd. For the audience, executions were just filler content, like commercials. Only instead of advertising soap, they demonstrated why you shouldn't steal one. And if that feels unsettling, that's kind of the point. The Colosseum wasn't just an arena, it was a carefully choreographed showcase of control every moment, including intermission. It was designed to remind the public who had power and what happened when you challenged it. In modern sports, referees make the calls. In the Roman Colosseum, the final verdict came from thousands of sweaty spectators who had eaten too much bread and were possibly 2 goblets deep into wine. Yes, in Rome, justice was crowdsourced. After a gladiator match, the loser didn't always die immediately if he fought well, or at least flailed with enthusiasm. The final decision rested with the audience. Would he live to fight another day, or become a cautionary tale for future footwork? Enter the thumbs. You probably heard of the famous thumbs down meaning death, except for plot twists. Historians aren't entirely sure which thumb meant what. Some sources say thumbs up meant execution, like a sword being drawn. Others say thumbs down meant sheathing the blade, aka mercy, and others argue the gestures weren't even about thumbs at all, but more vague hand waving that made gladiators wish Romans had just invented scorecards. Either way, the audience's reaction mattered, and they were not shy. They came to the Colosseum ready to cheer, boo, and yell unsolicited opinions at people literally fighting for their lives. It was an ancient yell, only with more tunics and fewer stars if a fighter was boring. He might get silence, the worst possible outcome. If he was excited, the crowd roared for mercy or punishment or both. It was a little unclear, honestly, but very loud. Some gladiators courted favor. They played in the stands. They had fans. Yes, actual fan bases. Certain fighters were known by name, and some even had merchandise. Okay, not official merchandise, but people wore carvings of them. Same idea. And if the emperor was present, oh, it got political fast. He could override the crowd's vote, granting mercy or insisting on execution. Either way, he was reading the room like a stand-up comic, but with higher stakes and fewer jokes. Well, depending on the emperor. So while the games looked like chaos, they were weirdly democratic, at least for the fighters. If you were entertained, you had a shot. If you didn't, well, the crowd was ready to vote with their voices, their hands, and occasionally their sandwiches. Because in the Colosseum, survival wasn't just about skill. It was about giving the people a good show and hoping they were in a generous mood. Of all the creatures you might expect to face in the Roman Colosseum, lions, tigers, that one guy with a net, the humble wild boar probably wouldn't top your list. But in ancient Rome, pigs weren't just food, they were part of the entertainment, and not in a cute farm petting zoo kind of way. Wild boars were no joke. These were muscular, tusk-wielding, forest-born battering rams with hoofs. Think of them as nature's angry bowling balls with less mercy and more momentum. Now imagine one of them charging at you in front of a cheering crowd while you try to look heroic in a leather skirt. Gladiators were trained for many things, but pig strategy was not high on the curriculum. Sometimes boars were used in animal hunts, released into the arena for fighters to take down with spears. Other times, in an effort to keep things spicy, the boars were introduced mid-combat as surprise guests. Nothing livened up a duel like a 300 lb pig sprinting across the stage uninvited in at least one event, records describe. An animal so aggressive that it charged through props, ignored its handler, and nearly ran into the front row. The Romans loved it. Nothing says great public funding like airborne pork. And if you're wondering how this counts as entertainment to the Roman crowd, unpredictability was the point. A lion was majestic, a tiger was terrifying, but a boar. That was hilarious, especially when someone underestimated it. Even emperors got in on the action. Some hosted themed hunts, showcasing their exotic animal collections, including particularly fierce pigs, just to prove how well stocked their empire was in both bacon and bravado. The fighters, meanwhile, were mostly just trying to survive. You could train to counter a sword. You could anticipate a human, but a wild boar. That was pure chaos in pig form, with tusks that turned kneecaps into hazards. And in the grand tradition of Roman entertainment, no one asked the important question, should we be doing this? They just asked, can we fit another boar into this scene? Spoiler, they could, and they often did. The arena floor was no ordinary stretch of sand. Beneath it lay a labyrinth of tunnels, cages, lifts, and pulleys, all carefully designed to ruin someone's afternoon. These mechanical marvels allowed stagehands to raise animals, props, or sometimes entire set pieces into the arena with unsettling theatrical timing. You're a gladiator mid-fight, sweating under the Roman sun, and just as you're about to win, boom, the floor opens and out comes a leopard. Not part of the match, just bonus content. This was not. Accidental Roman event planners. Yes, that was essentially a real job. I love surprises. Why have a normal duel when you could turn it into an obstacle course with hidden lions? And it wasn't just animals. Sometimes chariots would roll out, sometimes fire pits, sometimes large wooden constructs meant to represent mythological backdrops, like the underworld or a poorly made volcano. All of it designed to keep the crowd engaged and the participants deeply confused. It turned combat into theater and theater into absolute chaos. You didn't just fight your opponent. You fought the floor, the props, and your growing suspicion that someone behind the scenes was laughing very hard. These trapdoors were operated by teams of slaves and workers beneath the stage, coordinating timing with the precision of a military operation, or at least a mildly chaotic circus. One wrong lever and suddenly a bear appeared in the wrong scene, or worse, didn't appear at all, leaving two fighters awkwardly circling each other for 20 minutes. To the audience, it was thrilling. To the combatants, it was a lesson in humility and ankle awareness, because in the Colosseum you weren't just facing opponents, you were facing architecture, stage design, and the Roman Empire's deep commitment to surprising people with unpleasant things. If the gods truly favored the brave, then surely they also appreciated the ones who managed not to fall through a trapdoor mid-victory pose. At first glance, gladiator versus gladiator matches sound like the fairest part of the Colosseum schedule. Two trained professionals, well matched, facing off in front of a roaring crowd like ancient UFC, but with better outfits. But of course this is Rome. And fairness, as always, was optional. While some bouts were evenly matched for dramatic tension and crowd investment, many others were rigged faster than a politician's re-election campaign. One fighter might be a seasoned veteran with years of arena experience, the other a terrified rookie who just figured out which end of the sword was the business end. And don't get too attached to the idea of standard weapons either. Sometimes one fighter got a gladius and a shield. The other got a net and a trident, not because it made tactical sense, but because the crowd liked variety and someone in event planning had a flair for chaos. These odd pairings had names. The Secutor versus the Retiarius Trident guy was especially popular. One had armor, a big helmet, and traditional gear. The other wore almost nothing, carried a glorified fish fork, and relied on dodging for dear life. It was less battle of equals and more can speeding bare feet avoid being flattened? Why the mismatches? Because Rome loved contrast. The sight of two identically armed fighters was boring, but throw a bulky armored tank against a wiry, nearly naked rope flinger. Now that's entertainment. And if one gladiator had a growing fan base or a sponsor to impress, the match might be tilted in his favor, not so he could prove himself, but so he could look even cooler while winning. Gladiators weren't just fighters. They were investment, walking brand names. If someone had a dramatic win streak or a distinctive fighting style, the Empire leaned in. Fans bought figurines. Children reenacted their victories. Merchandising wasn't official, but it existed. So yes, sometimes they were handed an easy victory just to keep the legend alive. The losing fighter, well, he was either forgettable or unlucky. Possibly both. Because in the Colosseum, balance was an illusion. The audience didn't come for sportsmanship. They came to see someone outmatched and hopefully outmaneuvered. And if that person somehow won anyway, now that was a story. If you thought the Roman Colosseum was just about swords and sand, think again. It was also about spin. And not the kind that happens when someone gets hit too hard and falls in a dramatic spiral. No, this was politics. The Colosseum wasn't just a place to entertain the masses. It was a PR machine, custom-built to remind everyone exactly who was in charge. Every event, every match, every oops we released 2 Tigers moments was part of a carefully curated imperial message. Obey or else. Executions weren't just punishments, they were statements. Traitors, rebels, or just people who annoyed powerful senators were dispatched publicly and theatrically, often with backstory and staging. One day you're in a scroll with a bad opinion. The next day you're playing Fallen Hero number 2 in a reenactment of a myth you didn't ask to be part of. And the Emperor. He wasn't just watching, he was starring. He sat in the best seat, naturally, dead center, plenty of shade, and just close enough to the action to nod thoughtfully when someone was decapitated artistically. The crowd watched him as much as the fights. His reactions mattered. If he gave a thumbs up, it wasn't just a gesture. It was a headline. Some emperors used the games to build favor. Bread and circuses, remember? Keep the people fed and distracted, and they won't notice the empire's budget falling apart. Others used it to intimidate. A public execution here, a surprise lion dinner, all very motivating. And if you were lucky enough to be a popular gladiator, you could even be used politically. Fight well, and you were proof of Rome's strength. Refuse to die properly? Suddenly, you were a liability. Sometimes entire events were staged around political narratives. Celebrating a military victory? Great. Let's reenact it in the arena with extras and actual casualties. Hosting a foreign dignitary? Let's show them a good time with tigers. Nothing impresses a visiting official like a guy in armor jumping over a hippo. So yes, the Colosseum was Rome's most violent press conference. Every splash of sand and dramatic collapse was part of the Empire's broader messaging strategy. Rome is strong, Rome is glorious, and Rome is definitely watching. With all the mismatches, trapdoors, weaponized pigs, and political overtones, why did the Colosseum stay open for so long? Simple. Rome was addicted to spectacle. These weren't just shows. They were cultural events, political tools, social glue, and occasionally legally questionable therapy for a civilization that desperately needed hobbies. The empire was big, complicated, and frequently on fire. Sometimes literally. But give the people a gladiator match and suddenly everything feels stable. The formula worked. A bored, overtaxed citizen might complain about grain shortages, but toss them a seat in the Colosseum, a snack, and a front row view of someone wrestling a panther in a wig. Suddenly life wasn't so bad. That's Empire Building 101. Distract, dazzle, repeat, and emperors loved it. The games gave them instant approval ratings. Want to win the crowd after raising taxes? Host a week-long festival. Accidentally insulted the Senate? Released some flaming chariots and tigers? Want to make a general feel insecure? Have his enemy play the hero in a rest age myth and forget to tell him it's a metaphor? The Colosseum was the original social media feed. Constant updates, constant drama, a place where careers were made, enemies were erased, and your public image could be defined by a single thumb gesture. No comment section, though, just roaring applause or complete silence, which in Rome was basically a downvote. But even the greatest empires get tired. Over time, the shows became less extravagant, the animals harder to import, the audience less dazzling. By the time Rome began to crumble, even the Colosseum started to feel like yesterday's news. Sand and stone don't last forever, and neither do attention spans. Still, the legacy lingered. Even today, we remember the Colosseum not as a sports arena, but as a monument to how far a society will go for a good show. It wasn't fair. It wasn't kind. But it was unforgettable. Because when you build a stage for 50,000 people and fill it with fire, iron, and politics, well, you're not aiming for subtlety. You're aiming for history. Imagine you're a farmer in ancient Ireland. It's April 30th and the winds are shifting. You look out over the rolling hills and mutter to yourself, yep, time to light something on fire again. Welcome to Beltane, the ancient Celtic fire festival that wasn't just about celebrating the start of summer, it was about surviving it. While modern folks might pop a sunscreen bottle and complain about the heat, your ancestors were busy stacking wood and herding cows between two roaring bonfires. Why? Because they believed the smoke could purify, protect, and maybe even impress the local spirits. In this world, fire wasn't just a handy tool. It was a living force, a mediator between realms. Lighting it wasn't casual, it was sacred. The Druids, the spiritual MVPs of the community, were in charge of the flames. They'd chant, gesture dramatically, and eventually summon a central bonfire known as the Need Fire, which every household flame in the region was relit from. Think of it as a spiritual reset button, but with way more sparks and fewer user manuals. As the fires crackled, villagers would lead their livestock. Yes, the actual cows and sheep between the twin blazes. It sounds a bit excessive, but this was insurance against disease and misfortune. Want your cattle to stay healthy and productive? March them through fire. Want to stay fertile? Take a daring leap over the flames yourself. Nothing says romance like mild singing. And of course, there was dancing naked or clothed, depending on a year and how much mead was involved. Couples might jump the flames together to bind their love, while solo dancers hoped to stir some divine matchmaking from above. Beltane was more than a festival. It was a ritual of seasonal transformation, a fiery handshake between mortals and the other world. And once the fires died down, the embers were scattered in the fields, spreading the blessing of flame across the land. Now let's leave the damp hills of Celtic lands and cross into the arid, sun-blasted heart of ancient Persia. Here, fire wasn't something to dance around while hoping your sheep stayed healthy. It was a godly presence, a divine force that had to be fed, revered, and absolutely not sneezed on. Welcome to Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, where fire wasn't just sacred, it was truth itself. In fact, they called it Adar, a living symbol of Asher, the divine order of the universe. That meant fire wasn't just a helpful kitchen guest, it was a glowing representative of cosmic balance. So, no pressure. The centerpiece of worship was the fire temple, where priests known as mogs tended to eternal flames that had been burning for years, sometimes centuries. Think of them as divine janitors with robes armed not with extinguishers, but bundles of sandalwood and eagle feathers for gentle fanning. The idea was that this flame had to be kept alive, unbroken, unpolluted, undisturbed, letting it go out. That was basically a cosmic offense, a divine oopsie on a legendary scale. These fire rituals weren't limited to static worship either. During major festivals like Sada and Kaoshambasuri, whole communities would light bonfires in public squares to celebrate creation, rebirth, and the ever-ongoing battle between light and darkness. People would leap over the fires while chanting things like, "Give me your red color. Take away my sickly pallor." which, let's be honest, is basically the ancient Persian version of New Year, New Me. Sparks weren't just metaphorical in these moments. The fire became a messenger, carrying prayers to the heavens, while also warding off lurking demons and any bad luck that might have been hiding under your rug. Even funeral rites avoided flame directly touching the dead. Why? Because that would pollute it. Fire needed to stay clean, pure, and judgment-free, like an eternal therapist who's seen it all but never says a word. In the Persian view of things, fire wasn't something to be tamed. It was a sacred thread connecting humanity to the divine blueprint of the cosmos. A warm, flickering flame, yes, but also a blazing reminder to keep your soul and your kindling in good order. Now we jog literally into ancient Greece, where fire festivals weren't just holy ceremonies, they were full of athletic competitions. Because when the Greeks honored the gods, they didn't just pray, they sprinted with fire. The torch race, or Lampedodromia, was the signature event. Imagine a sacred relay where runners passed lit torches like flaming batons across Athens. And the goal wasn't just speed, it was to keep the flame alive. If you dropped your torch or let it go out, you were disqualified. Congratulations, you failed both your city and the divine. These races were held in honor of gods associated with fire and knowledge. Hephaestus, the forge god, and Prometheus, the rebellious titan who famously stole fire from Olympus and gave it to humanity. A bold move that earned him eternal liver-pecking punishment from Zeus, which in Greek mythology counts as a light slap on the wrist. The torch race wasn't just a sport. It was ritual theater. By keeping the flame burning, runners symbolized the endurance of divine wisdom passed down to mortals. It wasn't enough to possess the fire. You had to prove you could carry it without fumbling like a butterfingered apprentice in Hephaestus's workshop. And this wasn't a casual jog through the olive groves. The races were often held at night, the only light coming from the flaming torches bouncing through the darkness, casting shadows across temples, columns, and confused livestock. The visual impact was intentional. The gods were watching, and you better make it look epic. There were also deeper symbolic layers. Prometheus's gift of fire wasn't just warmth or cooking fuel. It represented intellect, transformation, rebellion. In honoring him with torch races, the Greeks weren't just reenacting a myth. They were subtly reminding themselves of their own clever defiance, their pursuit of civilization, even if it came at a divine cost. Winners received a crown or a small statue, possibly even a jar of olive oil, because this is Greece we're talking about. But the real prize was glory, and maybe a temporary break from angry gods smiting your crops. So the next time you see a modern Olympic torch relay, know that it's not just a sports tradition. It's a flickering echo of Greek reverence for stolen fire, cosmic rebellion, and the timeless art of running really fast while not burning your eyebrows off from Greek torch relays. We now turn to ancient India, where fire wasn't stolen from the gods. It was God. Meet Agni, the Hindu god of fire, who wasn't just a deity of warmth and light, but a cosmic postman. His role? Deliver offerings from earth to the heavens through fire. With perfect reliability, no lost packages, no customer service line. In Vedic rituals, the sacred ceremonies of ancient India, Agni was the bridge between humans and gods. Any prayer worth its salt needed fire, and not just any fire. It had to be lit properly, fed with clarified butter, ghee, basically the holy nectar of every ritual, and accompanied by mantras. These were called yajnas, and they were so important that priests devoted their entire lives to mastering them. Think of it as spiritual pyromania, but with a lot more incense and fewer insurance claims. In a typical yajna, a sacred fire pit called a havankan was constructed, often in intricate geometric patterns aligned with celestial forces. The fire had to be coaxed into life using friction or sacred chants, not a matchstick in sight, and once it was lit, Agni became alive. You weren't just watching a fire, you were making eye contact with a god. But this wasn't a one-time thing. The most devout households kept eternal fires burning, flames that never went out, passed down from generation to generation. If a fire died, it wasn't just inconvenient, it was a spiritual emergency. Some even believed it could disturb cosmic balance. Imagine being the guy who accidentally spilled water on a divine flame. Oops doesn't quite cover it. Fire festivals like Lori and Maka Sankranti later evolved to carry this Vedic legacy into seasonal celebrations, marking agricultural transitions with bonfires, songs, and offerings. It was joy wrapped in smoke, purification dancing in sparks, and unlike some traditions where fire was kept at arm's length, here was intimate living. And profoundly respected Agni wasn't feared like a wildfire. He was honored like an ancestor, a witness to every vow, every birth, every passing soul. If ancient India saw fire as a divine messenger, then ancient Egypt saw it as the very breath of the sun, God himself. Fire here wasn't just a flicker, it was cosmic authority embodied in Ra, the sun god who rode across the sky in a blazing solar bark, and every night he fought off a chaos serpent in the underworld, powered entirely by radiant celestial fire. No pressure, RA, but let's zoom in on the human rituals, because while RA handled the solar commute, Egyptians celebrated with flame too. Fire wasn't used for warmth. It was a symbol of purification, protection, and rebirth. Temples were designed to catch the morning sun in their darkest chambers. As if the gods themselves were turning on the lights, the most famous fire ritual, the Feast of Opet or the Weepit Renpet Festival, which marked the new year. It wasn't your average countdown and fireworks situation. It was a multi-day spectacle featuring priests, incense, offerings, and most importantly, ceremonial torches carried in processions. These weren't just for show. The fire represented Ra's rejuvenating energy returning to Earth, warding off darkness and illness. It was like spiritual pest control, but with sacred pyrotechnics. Even in funerary practices, fire played a crucial but carefully managed role. Egyptians didn't cremate, that was a little too final for them, but they burned incense and sacred oils during burial rites. The smoke rising from the offerings was believed to carry the soul's essence upward, helping it journey safely into the afterlife. And if the scent happened to please the gods, even better. Priests also maintained eternal flames within temples, particularly those dedicated to Ra or his fiery daughter Sekhmet, a lion-headed goddess you really didn't want to upset. Her festivals included fire rituals meant to appease her destructive nature. And yes, these sometimes involved beards dyed red to look like blood because Egyptian gods loved symbolism and mildly theatrical drama. Fire in Egypt wasn't chaotic. It was orderly, celestial, and radiant. It came with scrolls, hymns, and complex schedules. Every spark had a script. Now we descend into the jungles and highlands of ancient Mesoamerica, where fire didn't just symbolize life, it was the engine of the cosmos. And keeping that engine running required a bit more than candles and kind thoughts. Among the Aztecs, Maya, and Zapotecs, fire was a sacred force that governed time, agriculture, even human fate. But they didn't mess around with mere festivals. They had calendrical fire resets. Enter the new fire ceremony held every 52 years when the Aztec calendar completed its sacred cycle, a kind of cosmic Y2K, only with higher stakes and fewer IT professionals. As the dreaded date approached, all household fires were extinguished across the land. Cities went dark. People destroyed their belongings. They fasted, prayed, and basically assumed the world might end. Then, at midnight, priests ascended a sacred hilltop and performed a heart sacrifice. Only after the heart was burned and the new flame kindled on the chest cavity. Yes, really. Was the fire declared reborn? From this one divine spark, every household flame across the empire would be rekindled. Fire was rebirth, continuity, and cosmic validation. If the fire failed to light, the sun might not rise again. No pressure. In Maya civilization, fire also played a key role in temple dedications and royal rituals. Newly built temples were awakened with fire. They would literally burn offerings in a central chamber to activate the structure, as if inviting divine tenants to move in. And if you were a king, your accession to power required fire rites, including incense burning and sometimes ritual bloodletting, just to show you meant it. The Zapotecs were just as committed. Their fire god, Cochilo, was closely tied to storms and lightning, and festivals in his honor included bonfires, dances, and occasionally the dramatic burning of symbolic effigies, sort of a divine piñata with a flammable personality. Across all these cultures, fire was a dialogue with the gods, but also a demand. It was hungry, and it needed feeding, not just with logs or copal resin, but with sacrifice. The smoke didn't just rise, it spoke. Now let's sail into the vast Pacific, where islands of the ocean like stepping stones of fire. For the ancient Polynesians, fire wasn't just a necessity, it was an origin story, a divine inheritance passed down from gods who lived inside mountains. At the heart of many Polynesian fire beliefs stands the goddess Pele, the tempestuous spirit of volcanoes, particularly revered in Hawaiian mythology. She wasn't a calm hearth goddess gently tending your cooking pot. She was a blazing force of nature who created islands with her lava, then destroyed them in a fit of divine rage. Respecting fire in this culture wasn't optional. It was survival. Pele was said to live in the Halimumiu crater at the summit of Kilauea, one of the most active volcanoes in the world. When it erupted, it wasn't a natural disaster. It was Pele expressing herself. Lava flows were seen as her fiery footsteps, reshaping the land according to divine will. People left offerings near craters, flowers, food, chants, sometimes even hair or nails. Because when a goddess is literally remaking geography, it pays to stay on her good side. Fire festivals in Polynesia took many forms, but one of the most mesmerizing was the Shiva AFI, or fire knife dance, still performed in places like Samoa and Tonga, originally part of warrior rituals. The dance involved spinning flaming knives while leaping, flipping, and generally defying common sense. It wasn't just showmanship, it was a spiritual display. The fire knife was seen as an extension of inner strength, a dance with ancestral power. In everyday life, Polynesians used fire to cook in umu, earth ovens, light paths during ceremonies, and communicate with the spirit world. Fire was the bridge between visible and invisible, the earthly and the divine. Even funeral rites involved sacred torches and chants, guiding the soul toward ancestral realms across the sea. Some islanders believed that ancestral spirits traveled on flame, visible in the flickering of torches or the glow of fireflies. To ignore or mishandle fire was to risk offending both gods and ghosts. You think the frigid lands of ancient Scandinavia would be too cold and soggy for fiery rituals. But the Norse had a relationship with fire that was anything but lukewarm. In a land of icy fjords and eternal winters, fire meant more than comfort. It meant survival, both physical and spiritual. At the heart of Norse mythology is a cosmic duality, fire and ice. The world itself was born from the clash between Muspelheim, the realm of fire, and Niflheim, the land of frost, when the two collided in the primordial void of Ginnungagap. Sparks flew literally, and out of that chaos came the first being, Ymir, and eventually the gods. So fire wasn't just essential, it was a creator and a destroyer. The most feared fire figure in Norse mythology was Surta, a fire giant from Muspelheim who, according to prophecy, would ride out during Ragnarok, the Norse apocalypse, with a flaming sword in hand. His mission? Burn the world to ash. You can see how fire wasn't taken lightly. On a more earthly level, fire festivals marked seasonal changes, especially the end of winter and the return of the sun. Celebrations like Yule, which later merged with Christmas, were deeply fire-centric. Great logs were burned for days. Hello Yule log, representing the rebirth of the sun. The longer it burned, the better your luck for the coming year. Lighting the Yule fire wasn't just cozy, it was cosmic insurance. Bonfires were also lit during midsummer festivals, where the light was at its peak and spirits roamed more freely. Leaping over flames, a practice shared with other cultures, was believed to grant protection, fertility, and possibly the ability to impress your crush. And when it came to death, fire had the final word. Viking funerals weren't all longboats and slow-motion archery. Yes, cremation was common, and fire was believed to release the soul to Valhalla or Folkwanger, the afterlife realms of warriors and the chosen. The fire cleansed, elevated, and honored. It was part farewell, part transformation, and part dramatic flair. Across the ancient world, fire wasn't just life-giving, it was judgmental. It could warm your home or incinerate your legacy for many cultures. Fire became the ultimate test. the tool of divine justice, spiritual purification, and cosmic reckoning. And unlike modern courts, there were no appeals. In ancient India, fire wasn't only a god, it was also a witness. In the epic Ramayana, Sita, wife of the hero Rama, had to undergo a trial by fire, literally. After being kidnapped and rescued, she walked through flames to prove her purity. The fire Agni himself emerged not with a guilty verdict, but with a divine nod. She was unscathed and therefore innocent. A hot mess of gender expectations, yes, but also an example of how fire was seen as the final arbiter of truth. In medieval and ancient Europe, similar ideas took root in trial by ordeal. Suspected criminals, witches, or unfortunates with bad luck were sometimes subjected to fire-based tests, like holding a red-hot iron or walking across glowing coals. If their wounds healed cleanly, they were innocent. If not, well, you probably didn't want to be around for the closing arguments. While these trials weren't exactly spiritually uplifting, they showed the lingering belief that fire could reveal divine will. In Zoroastrianism, one of the earliest notions of fire as judgment emerged in the concept of Chinvat Bridge, the crossing point to the afterlife. At death, souls would walk a blade-thin bridge above a river of molten metal. Those who had lived righteously would find it as gentle as warm milk. The wicked? Let's just say they discovered that divine metal has no chill. Even the Aztecs, who worshipped fire with meticulous devotion, saw it as a cyclical trial. If their new fire ceremony failed, the world could end. Fire, once a gift from the gods, could also become their chosen method of cosmic deletion. It kept humanity humble and maybe a little flammable. Throughout all these traditions, fire became a mirror. What you brought to it, truth, guilt, devotion, or fear, was what it revealed. Whether in sacred rites or terrifying trials, fire was the final exam of the soul. In ancient Egypt, paying taxes wasn't just an economic duty. It was practically a spiritual obligation. The pharaoh wasn't your average bureaucrat. He was the divine middleman between gods and humans. So when he demanded tribute, it wasn't viewed as exploitation. It was seen as maintaining cosmic balance. Mot, the sacred order of the universe. Nothing like being taxed by a god to keep things in perspective. Money, as we know, it didn't really exist in early Egyptian society. So how did the pharaoh fill his royal coffers? Grain. Lots and lots of grain. The Nile's annual flooding ensured fertile fields, and after harvest, scribes would arrive, clipboard in hand, or rather papyrus scroll, to measure exactly how much you owed. They used rope, sticks, and something resembling a calculator made of frustration. If your land produced 10 sacks, you might owe 3 to the state. Not paying, not an option. You could lose your land, your cattle, or find yourself mysteriously volunteered for a state labor project. Because yes, you could also pay in labor. The towering pyramids of Giza weren't built by aliens or slaves. They were built in part by taxpayers. If you didn't have enough grain or goods, you could be conscripted for public works, hauling limestone, digging irrigation canals, or constructing the latest shrine of Horus. Congratulations! You're now part of Egypt's National Infrastructure Initiative. The whole system was recorded meticulously by scribes, those sharp-eyed record keepers with a monopoly on literacy. They documented everything, from how much wheat you owed to whether your donkey was taxable. Yes, even animals could be taxed. If it moved and had value, chances are the state wanted a piece of it. Egypt's tax system was centralized, efficient, and when needed, brutally enforced. But it was also flexible. During years of famine or poor flooding, tax collectors might reduce quotas. Not out of kindness necessarily, but because dead farmers don't pay taxes. Leave it to the Romans to turn bodily functions into taxable assets. In the sprawling empire of marble forms and gladiator games, taxation was both a bureaucratic art and a source of legendary grumbling. You could be taxed for land, slaves, doors. And yes, urine, because nothing says an efficient government like charging people to pee. Let's start with the infamous urine tax, or vectigal urinary. Public urinals and fullers' workshops collected human urine, which was then used, no joke, as a source of ammonia to bleach clothing and tan leather. So when Emperor Vespasian realized this bodily byproduct was chemically useful, He did what any responsible emperor would do. He taxed the collectors. The phrase money doesn't stink, pecunia non olet, was born when his son Titus questioned the morality of such a tax. Vespasian handed him a coin and asked if it smelled. It didn't. Point made. But that's just the tip of the imperial iceberg. Rome had taxes on windows to encourage modest architecture. Slave ownership came with its own tariff, and inheritance taxes could shave off a chunk of what you left behind. There was even a sales tax, though it only applied to free citizens, because if you were enslaved, congratulations, you were already a form of taxable property. Tax collectors were called publicani, and let's just say they weren't winning popularity contests. These middlemen paid the state in advance for the right to collect taxes, then squeezed citizens for as much as possible to turn a profit. They were the ancient equivalent of a private collection agency run by a hedge fund. And if you refused to pay, soldiers might show up to help convince you. Despite all this, Roman taxation funded some impressive projects: aqueducts, roads, temples, and military conquests that stretched the empire from Britain to Syria. You could argue that Roman taxes built civilization and crushed it, depending on where you stood. And yes, tax revolts happened. Provinces groaned under the weight of tribute, and more than one rebellion started with the words "how much?" In the heart of Mesoamerica, the Aztec Empire ran one of the most elaborate and structured tribute systems the world has ever seen. And no, it wasn't based on gold or coins. It was powered by cocoa beans, jaguar pelts, and feathers so fine they made European kings look underdressed. Unlike modern tax systems, Aztec taxation was known as tribute, and it operated like a giant imperial wish list. The emperor didn't need your permission. He needed your region's best products delivered regularly and preferably without excuses. Every city, state, or altepetl that fell under Aztec control was required to send tribute. Recorded meticulously by scribes known as Calpixca, these men carried detailed codices illustrating what was owed. Not numbers, but pictures. Piles of maize, stacks of cotton, bundles of obsidian, and yes, sacks of cocoa beans. Think of it as a pictorial invoice from hell. Cocoa beans were especially valuable, not just as food or drink, but as currency. A handful could buy a tamale, a cloak, or a night out at the local human sacrifice. They were so prized that counterfeiters tried to hollow them out and refill them with dirt. Audacious, yes, but also a crime punishable by death. The IRS of Tenochtitlan did not mess around. Tribute items could range from the delicious turkey's honey to the decorative jade gold dust, to the downright inconvenient giant logs carried from forests miles away. One province had to deliver embroidered warrior costumes regularly, complete with battle-ready sandals. Another specialized in exotic bird feathers, which were woven into headdresses for nobles and gods alike. Imagine trying to explain to your village why your tax burden is 30 live parrots and 2 jaguar pelts. Sorry kids, jaguar chasing day again. Failure to pay tribute could result in violent retribution. Aztec tax collectors weren't shy, and rebellious provinces were often met with military reminders. Compliance was a matter of survival, not civic duty. Despite the harsh terms, the tribute system kept the empire thriving. The capital, Tenochtitlan, was a city of floating gardens, gleaming temples, and markets bursting with goods, much of it paid for by the backs of tributary towns in ancient China. Taxation was less about flamboyant punishments or bizarre goods, and more about sheer scale. With a population in the tens of millions and an empire that seemed to go on forever, China built a bureaucratic tax machine so vast and precise it would make Roman senators weep into their wine. Let's start with the basics: rice and labor. During the Han Dynasty, peasants were the economic backbone, and they paid taxes in 3 primary forms: grain, cloth, and corvette labor. The grain filled the empire's granaries. The cloth was handed to state officials, and the labor, well, that meant weeks or months away from home, working on canals, roads, or the occasional Great Wall renovation. Think of it as tax season, but instead of paperwork, you're hauling bricks through the Gobi. As the empire evolved, so did its taxes. The Tang Dynasty introduced the 2 tax systems, which was meant to simplify things. It required twice yearly payments, once in summer, once in autumn, calculated according to how much land you owned and how many people you had lying around eating your rice. In theory, it was fair. In practice, tax collectors had a flexible understanding of fair. And then came the salt tax, the quiet empire builder. Rather than taxing everyone equally, the government slapped a heavy tax on salt, a daily necessity. Everyone needed it, especially in a time before refrigerators, and so the state made a fortune. For centuries, salt revenue funded armies, palaces, and bureaucrats' pensions. It's no exaggeration to say salt underwrote dynasties, but taxation wasn't just about funding, it was about control. Census taking was practically an art form, as were land surveys and household registries. The goal? To know exactly how much rice you grew, how many sons you had, and whether you were hiding a second ox behind a barn. Of course, it wasn't all order and harmony. Excessive taxation was one of the top causes of peasant revolts, like the Yellow Turban Rebellion, which exploded in the late Han period. When farmers are starving and still being asked for 30% of their rice, bad things tend to happen. Long before modern accountants began asking for your W-2s, ancient Mesopotamians were already inventing the fine art of taxation, with clay tablets, reed styluses, and absolutely zero tolerance for creative deductions. In the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, the Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians created the world's first tax system, and with it, history's first recorded complaint about taxes. Instead of paper forms, scribes etched tax records into soft clay. These cuneiform tablets, thousands of them, documented everything from barley contributions to livestock tallies. If you think your local tax office is slow, try waiting for your grain levy to be logged by a man scratching symbols into mud. The staple tax? Barley. In early city-states like Uruk and Lagash, farmers paid a portion of their harvest to the temple or palace. And the temples weren't just religious centers. They were full-blown economic hubs with tax officials, storerooms, and surprisingly stern priests. But grain wasn't all. Mesopotamians taxed fishermen on their catch, traders on their goods, and craftsmen on their workshops. Even donkeys weren't safe. If you had a working donkey or a cart, congratulations, you were now a small, taxable transport business under the Babylonian king Hammurabi. Taxation became even more structured. His famous legal code, one of the oldest in the world, laid out penalties for tax evasion, overcharging officials, and cheating the system. In some cases, the punishment wasn't just a fine, it was death or dismemberment. So if you ever feel like your modern tax form is harsh, remember, at least it doesn't come with a potential amputation. One unique feature of Mesopotamian taxation was its integration into public works. Citizens might pay taxes in bricks, silver, or labor, helping build canals, ziggurats, and city walls. If you couldn't pay in goods, the state could take your time or your children's time. Nothing says fiscal responsibility like loaning your kid to the temple for a season. Yet despite its age, the Mesopotamian tax system was remarkably efficient. It helped manage sprawling cities, fund irrigation networks, and support armies. In other words, it kept the whole operation from crumbling like a sun-baked mud brick. In ancient Greece, taxes were less about state order and more about awkwardly passing the bill around. Unlike centralized empires like Egypt or China, many Greek city-states, especially Athens, relied on a mix of civic pride, social pressure, and well-disguised tax avoidance strategies. Let's start with the basics. Direct taxation on citizens was rare. Athenian citizens didn't pay income tax like we do today. Instead, they were expected to contribute to the state through liturgies, a fancy way of saying, hey, rich guy, it's your turn to pay for a play, a worship, or a festival. These weren't technically taxes, but try saying no and still getting invited to dinner. Meanwhile, foreigners and medics, resident aliens who lived and worked in Athens, did pay taxes. They were required to fork over a monthly protection fee, which covered the privilege of not being a full citizen. Essentially, thanks for living here. Now cough it up. Trade was another gold mine. Import and export goods came through the bustling port of Piraeus, and Athens made sure to grab its cut with customs taxes, tolls, and docking fees. You could tax olive oil, wine, or pottery, just not ideas. Those flowed freely from the mouths of philosophers who naturally had opinions about taxation too. Plato believed that rulers should live modestly and serve the state, not profit from it. Aristotle was the realist, saw taxation as a necessary part of governance, though he noted that excessive taxation could lead to rebellion. Meanwhile, the average Athenian just wanted the tax collectors to stay far away from their grape harvest. Which brings us to the real villains of the story, tax farmers. Rather than collecting taxes themselves, Greek states auctioned off the right to collect them. The highest bidder would pay the state up front, then go out and recoup the money, plus plenty extra. These tax farmers were about as popular as wet tunics at a symposium. Despite the chaos, the system worked, more or less. Taxes funded temples, wars, roads, and democracy itself. But resentment simmered, especially among the poor, and tax abuse occasionally led to public outrage, lawsuits, or exile. Welcome to the Inca Empire, where you didn't pay taxes with money or even cocoa beans. You pay with your hands, feet, and spine. The Inca created one of the most impressive civilizations in the Americas, stretching across modern-day Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Chile. And they did it without coins, markets, or written language. So, how did they fund it all? With a tax system based entirely on labor, known as the mitter. The mitter wasn't a suggestion. It was mandatory state service. Every able-bodied male citizen owed the empire a set number of days each year, usually spent building roads, farming state land, mining silver, or hauling stones for temples and fortresses. Picture the Inca tax form as a calendar, not a bill. The genius of the mitta system was its efficiency. Instead of centralizing everything in one place, the empire broke up labor across thousands of local communities called ailis. Each ailil sent its workers when called upon, and in return the empire provided food, tools, and access to communal storehouses. You gave your time and survived. Need a bridge over a mountain gorge? The mitta provided. Need hundreds of miles of paved roads to connect cities like Cusco and Machu Picchu? Mitta. Want a massive stone temple where each block weighs as much as a bus? Yes, that too. But the taxes didn't stop at muscle. Citizens were also expected to grow crops on state-owned fields, raise llamas for transport, and weave cloth for the military and aristocracy. Entire regions specialized in producing maize, potatoes, or textiles for redistribution. The empire stored these goods in enormous warehouses, kolkas, strategically placed along roads for use in times of famine or war, unlike many other ancient civilizations. The Incas didn't use tax collectors in the traditional sense. Instead, local leaders kept quipus, knotted cords used to track labor and production. They didn't need writing when they had the world's most complex tax abacus made of string. And yes, resistance existed. After the Spanish arrived, they co-opted the mitta for forced mining labor, which quickly turned exploitative and deadly. What had once been a system of communal duty became a nightmare. During the Islamic Golden Age, from the 8th to 13th centuries, the empires of the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Europe ran some of the most sophisticated taxation systems the world had seen since Rome. But unlike earlier models of raw extraction, Islamic taxation came wrapped in moral philosophy, religious duty, and meticulous bookkeeping. At the heart of it all was zakat, a religious tax, and one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It wasn't just a donation, it was mandatory. Every able Muslim was expected to give around 2.5% of their wealth annually to help the poor, the indebted, and travelers in need. It was a tax designed not to fund palaces or armies, but to promote social justice. Think of it as the original wealth redistribution scheme, only with divine oversight. But zakat was just the beginning. There was also the carriage, a land tax levied on non-Muslims who farmed conquered lands, and the jizya, a poll tax paid by non-Muslims in exchange for protection and exemption for military service. These taxes weren't arbitrary. They were legally defined, scaled according to wealth, and in many cases negotiated between communities and rulers. Non-Muslims could keep their religions and local customs as long as they paid on time. To manage all this, the caliphates developed a professional class of scribes and accountants. They kept ledgers in Arabic script, tracked markets, and issued receipts. The diwan, or state treasury, was not a chaotic chest of coins, but a centralized bureaucracy with trained clerks and standardized forms. Think Excel sheets, but on parchment. One unique feature of Islamic taxation was its connection to market regulation. Officials known as muqtasibs roamed bazaars to ensure fair pricing, honest weights, and moral conduct. If you tried to hide your profits to avoid zakat, the muqtasib might appear with a scale, a stern stare, and possibly a citation from the Quran. And while corruption wasn't unknown, there were regular audits and public accountability. Some rulers, like Umar ibn al-Khattab, were known for walking the streets in disguise, checking that tax burdens weren't crushing the people. In many ways, taxation in the Islamic Golden Age balanced profit with piety. It built schools, hospitals, libraries, and fostered an intellectual explosion that influenced Europe for centuries. In medieval Europe, paying taxes was less about civic duty and more about surviving feudal extortion with most of your limbs intact, while kings and nobles claimed divine right. It was the peasants who felt the weight of every coin, chicken, and bale of hay that disappeared into the tax wagon. The most notorious medieval tax, the tithe, this wasn't a state-imposed levy, but a mandatory 10% of your income paid to the church. That meant a tenth of your crops, livestock, or fish went straight to the local monastery. Refused to pay? You weren't just dodging taxes, you were risking eternal damnation. It's hard to argue with a tax backed by the threat of hellfire. Then came the feudal dues. If you were a peasant, your life was basically a subscription service to your lord. You paid for the land you farmed, for the mill you used, for the oven where you baked your bread. Got married? That was a fee. Inherited your father's field? Another fee. Had a particularly good harvest? Expect a smiling tax collector at your door with his hand out, and a list of creative new charges. In England, after the Norman conquest, taxation became even more organized and ominous. The Domesday Book, compiled under William the Conqueror, was a giant survey of who owned what, down to how many pigs you had hiding in the back garden. It was essentially a tax sniper's scope, and no one escaped its gaze. By the 13th century, kings discovered new ways to raise funds, especially for war. In France and England, monarchs began introducing direct taxes on income and property. But with centralized power came centralized resentment. Tax collectors were often hated more than enemy armies, and when the state pushed too far, revolted. The English peasants' revolt of 1381 exploded in response to a brutal poll tax, a flat fee per person regardless of wealth. It was the medieval equivalent of charging a lord and a farmer the same amount, and expecting no one to notice. Spoiler, they noticed. Taxation in medieval Europe was a tightrope walk, enough to fund castles, cathedrals, and crusades, but not so much that it led to pitchforks and fire. And so, from cocoa beans to urine, from rice to forced labor, ancient taxation wasn't just about economics. It was about power, control, and the fragile thread between rulers and the ruled. One coin, one grain, one revolt at a time. To the Vikings, death wasn't the end. It was simply the beginning of a new journey. Life was fleeting, unpredictable, and often brutal. But death? That was where the real adventure began. And depending on how you lived, or more importantly, how you died, you could find yourself in vastly different destinations beyond the grave. The most coveted afterlife was Valhalla, the Golden Hall of Odin, where slain warriors gathered to feast, fight, and prepare for Ragnarok, the end of all things. To reach Valhalla, though, you had to die in battle, ideally while doing something heroic and very bloody. If that wasn't on the menu, there was still Folkvanga, the realm of the goddess Freya, who got first pick of the fallen. It's believed that her hall was equally prestigious, just with fewer head injuries. But not all souls went to warrior paradise. Those who died from sickness, old age, or without enough flair were said to drift to hell, the shadowy realm ruled by the goddess of the same name. Contrary to modern interpretations, hell wasn't necessarily a punishment, just a more subdued afterlife, possibly with fewer drinking horns and battle songs. With such an elaborate spiritual map, it's no surprise that Viking funeral rites were carefully staged performances. Part tribute, part guidance system for the soul, and part flex for the living. A well-executed funeral showed respect, wealth, and community status. A sloppy one, that was a recipe for haunting, bad luck, or worse. A dishonored soul wandering without rest. These funerals weren't about closure. They were about ensuring safe passage to the next world and proving that the deceased mattered both in life and in death. Even the humblest funeral might include offerings of food, weapons, and personal belongings to equip the departed for their journey. And for the elite, the Norse didn't do subtle things. Chieftains, warriors, and nobles often received grand send-offs involving ships, flames, burial mounds, animal sacrifices, and entire ceremonies performed with chilling precision. The goal was not just to honor the dead, but to cement their legacy in the sagas and in memory, because in Viking culture, to be remembered was to live on. The funeral wasn't the final chapter, it was the first page of the afterlife. In Viking society, the dead weren't just dumped in a pit and forgotten. They were prepared with care, intention, and a touch of theatrical flair. If death was a journey, then the deceased needed to be dressed like a traveler. And packed like one, too. Once a person passed, their body was washed, combed, and dressed in their finest clothing. This wasn't about vanity. It was symbolic. Cleanliness showed respect, and fine garments helped ensure the deceased entered the next world with honor. A chieftain might be laid out in a rich woolen tunic, his cloak trimmed in fur. A shield maiden might wear embroidered dresses, adorned with brooches and beads. Jewelry wasn't just for show. It was spiritual luggage. Weapons were essential. A warrior might be buried with his sword, axe, or spear, along with a shield. These weren't ceremonial props. They were actual tools for the afterlife. After all, if you're going to fight all day in Valhalla, you want your favorite blade by your side. Even common folk were sometimes buried with knives or simple tools. Suggesting that utility mattered as much as status, the dead were also given grave goods, drinking horns, cooking pots, combs, dice, and sometimes food and mead. It's as if they were packing for a very long trip with a few snacks and a bit of entertainment. These objects served practical, religious, and sentimental purposes. In some cases, they were deliberately broken before burial, a practice that may have released the object's spirit for use in the afterlife. Social rank played a big role. The wealthier or more important the person, the more elaborate the prep. There are records of servants or slaves being sacrificed to join their masters, though these were rare and usually reserved for high-ranking individuals. It was brutal, yes, but in Viking belief, it was an honor to accompany your lord into the next world once the body was prepared. It was laid out for a time, giving the community a chance to mourn, reflect, and say goodbye. This was also when the funerary rituals would begin in earnest. Prayers, chants, and even ritualized storytelling to cement the dead's legacy. To the Vikings, preparing the dead wasn't a grim task. It was an act of love, of respect, and of cosmic responsibility. They weren't just dressing a corpse. They were arming a soul for the journey beyond. When most people think of Viking funerals, they picture a flaming longship drifting into the horizon, sails ablaze, carrying a warrior to Valhalla. It's an image burned into pop culture, cinematic, dramatic, and just a little impractical. But how accurate was it? The short answer: partly true, partly poetic license. Vikings had a deep relationship with ships. These weren't just modes of transportation. They were symbols of power, status, and life itself. To be buried in a ship, or even with part of one, was the ultimate farewell. For seafarers, warriors, and nobles, it represented a return to the sea, to the gods, or to the great journey ahead. But contrary to popular belief, most Viking funeral ships were not set on fire and pushed out to sea. That image likely comes from a combination of later medieval myths and 19th century romantic paintings. In reality, full ship burials were rare and expensive. When they did happen, the ship was usually placed on land, the body and grave goods arranged inside, and the whole structure was either buried under a mound or set on fire in place. One of the most famous examples is the Oseberg burial found in Norway. It contained a beautifully carved ship, holding two women, richly dressed, surrounded by textiles, sledges, and animal sacrifices. No flames, just earth and legacy. Another example, the Gokstad burial, held the body of a chieftain, his weapons, tools, and even sacrificed horses. Again, no water, no fire, just honor and craftsmanship. That said, There were cremation burials involving boats, or symbolic representations of them. In some regions, smaller boats or boat-shaped outlines made of stones were used in cremation ceremonies, with a pyre built directly on the ship. These events were spectacular, if not logistically simple. Burning an entire boat took a lot of wood, space, and nerves of steel. The fire wasn't just for show. In Viking belief, fire purified the soul, sending smoke upward to the gods. It also prevented the dead from returning as restless spirits, a very real fear in Norse mythology. Viking funerals weren't just solemn affairs, they were investments in the afterlife. The dead weren't sent off empty-handed. Instead, they were loaded up with grave goods, the kind of spiritual starter pack designed to ensure comfort, status, and survival in the next world. Let's start with the essentials. Almost every Viking burial, from simple farmer to powerful jarl, included tools, weapons, and personal belongings. A man might be buried with his sword, axe, or bow. A woman might have keys, brooches, weaving tools, or even cooking pots. These weren't symbolic trinkets. They were believed to be used by the soul after death in whatever realm they were bound for. Whether Valhalla or Hell, no one wanted to show up unarmed, or without proper home goods. Wealthier individuals received more elaborate send-offs. Some burials include drinking horns, board games, imported silks, musical instruments, and entire carts or sledges. One woman in the famous Oseberg burial was interred with an ornate wagon, 5 intricately carved animal heads, and dozens of textiles, enough to open a boutique in the afterlife. But what really set Viking funerals apart was their use of animal sacrifice. Horses were common companions in elite burials, symbols of status, transportation, and power. Archaeologists have uncovered graves with multiple horses, carefully arranged, clearly sacrificed for the occasion. Dogs, hawks, and even oxen also make appearances, each likely chosen for specific spiritual or symbolic reasons. In some cases, the sacrifices extended beyond animals. Slaves or servants might be killed and buried alongside their master. This wasn't casual cruelty. It was considered a form of loyalty or service, though from a modern perspective, it's undeniably grim. Some accounts, like that of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, describe shocking rituals where a slave girl was ritually killed to accompany a chieftain into the afterlife. Believing she would continue to serve him in death, everything placed in the grave, living or lifeless, had a purpose. The Vikings believed the soul needed support, just as it did in life. Grave goods were gifts, provisions, and protection meant to carry status and functionality across the cosmic divide. In Viking culture, death didn't just take someone from the world, it left a mark on it. And that mark was often massive, unmistakable, and visible for miles. Enter the burial mound, or Horga in Old Norse, a carefully crafted hill raised over the dead to honor their life, their deeds, and, let's be honest, their social standing. These weren't just piles of dirt. Viking burial mounds were deliberate monuments built with labor and care. A chieftain's mound might be raised over a buried ship or wooden chamber, filled with grave goods and sealed with layers of stone and soil. Some were covered in turf to blend with the landscape. Others left raw and stony, a permanent message to the living. Somewhat important lies here. The size of the mound mattered. Bigger mound, bigger legacy. These weren't just graves. They were status symbols, visible reminders of a family's power, wealth, and ancestry in some cases. Mounds were arranged in specific patterns, forming ship shapes or ritual alignments with celestial events. Yes, Vikings were practical, but they were also deeply symbolic. These mounds also served a communal role. They became sacred places, sites of remembrance and storytelling. Families might gather there for seasonal rituals, feasts, or oaths. The burial mound became a bridge between generations, between the living and the dead, and sometimes they weren't content to bury just one person. Mounds could contain multiple graves added over time, turning a single burial into a dynastic monument. In this way, land wasn't just occupied by the living, it was claimed by the dead, shaping identity and memory for centuries. Not all Viking burials were so grand. Common folk might receive flat graves or simple stone circles, especially in regions where soil and space made mound building impractical. But even these had care. Grave goods, cremation remains, and orientation with the sun or stars. It was a reminder that even in modest death, the Viking spirit sought meaning to burn or to bury. That was the Viking funeral dilemma, and the answer depended on region, status, era, and belief. While modern Viking imagery tends to lean heavily toward dramatic flames and fire-lit farewells, the truth is more nuanced. Vikings used both cremation and inhumation, often side by side in the same communities. Let's start with cremation. In early Viking periods, especially in Sweden and parts of Denmark, cremation was the dominant rite. The body would be placed on a funeral pyre, surrounded by grave goods and set ablaze. The fire was not just destruction, it was purification, a spiritual release. The rising smoke carried the soul upward, perhaps to Odin, perhaps to another realm entirely. After the flames died down, the ashes and charred bones were carefully collected and either buried in an urn or scattered in a stone-lined grave. But cremation wasn't just about reaching the gods, it also served practical purposes. In societies where space was limited, or where wild animals posed a threat to shallow graves, fire made sense. And let's not ignore the psychological side. Cremation ensured the dead didn't return. Norse myths are full of restless spirits, undead warriors, and revenants. Reducing a body to ash made haunting less likely. As time passed, especially by the late Viking Age, inhumation, the burial of intact bodies, became more common, particularly under the growing influence of Christianity. Inhumation was more in line with Christian ideas of resurrection and bodily preservation. But even before Christianity, some Viking communities favored burial in chambers, ships, or wooden coffins, with the body laid out in full dress, surrounded by goods, animals, and tools. Interestingly, both methods often coexisted. A chieftain might be cremated on a pyre while his wife was buried nearby, or cremation might be used for warriors while inhumation suited farmers and traders. The choice could reflect personal identity, social class, or regional custom. What united both rites was the attention to detail and honor. Whether turned to smoke or sealed beneath a mound, the Viking dead were treated with reverence as travelers heading into the next world, however they chose to get there. Viking funerals weren't quiet affairs. They were ritualistic send-offs, full of song, storytelling, toasts, and symbolic acts, while the physical treatment of the body, burning, burying, loading into ships was essential. The rituals of the living were just as important. To die well was one thing, but to be remembered properly, that was immortality. At the heart of many Viking funerals were songs and poetry. Skalds or poets played a crucial role in preserving the memory of the deceased. They composed elegies and funeral verses, recounting the person's deeds, their lineage, their victories, and even their personality quirks. These verses weren't just mournful. They were epic, casting the dead in the mold of saga heroes. If you weren't sung about at your own funeral, did you even die a Viking? Funerals also involved ritual toasting, known as the Minne. Drinking horns were passed, mead flowed, and each toast honored not just the departed, but the gods, ancestors, and fate itself. These were solemn moments, but also deeply social, blending mourning with camaraderie. It was grief expressed with firelight and fermented honey. Offerings were made at the gravesite, sometimes food, sometimes weapons, sometimes blood. Sacrifices, especially of animals, could accompany the funeral, intended to guide or sustain the soul in the afterlife. These rituals were often led by a Gothic priest or vulvicrs, who conducted ceremonies with chants, symbolic gestures, and possibly a few unprintable incantations. In wealthier funerals, ritualized performances took place. Ibn Fadlan, the 10th century Arab diplomat, famously described the funeral of a Rus chieftain, likely a Norseman settled along the Volga, which involved days of preparation, animal sacrifices, and the ritual killing of a slave girl who volunteered to accompany her master. Though horrifying by modern standards, it reveals the theatrical and religious weight the Vikings gave to death rites. Finally, memorial feasts could be held weeks later. These served to settle affairs, redistribute possessions, and honor the legacy. New leaders might be named oaths sworn, stories told again. For the Vikings, death wasn't just a loss. It was a story to be told, a song to be sung. and a life to be celebrated with fire, voice, and drink. While fire consumed the body and song carried the soul, stone preserved the name. In Viking society, memory wasn't left to chance. It was carved, letter by letter, into the very bones of the earth. And thus came the rise of the runestone, one of the most enduring Viking traditions of all. Runestones weren't gravestones in the modern sense. You weren't placing a small marker next to a plot. You were erecting a public monument meant to be seen, read, and respected. These stones stood along roads, near bridges, at crossroads, and beside burial mounds, bold declarations of the life and legacy of the dead. The inscriptions were written in runic script, an alphabet used across the Norse world. Some were simple. Gunnar raised this stone in memory of his brother. Others were sprawling epics, recounting voyages, battles, and deeds. Some even included curses for anyone who dared to face or move the stone. If you move the stone, may your bones rot and your cattle give no milk. Vikings didn't mess around. And while many stones honored warriors and chieftains, others memorialized merchants, travelers, and even women. A famous example is the Jelling stones in Denmark, massive rune stones erected by King Harald Bluetooth to honor his parents and declare the Christianization of Denmark. They blend pagan tradition with emerging Christian influence, showing how rune stones adapted over time. The act of carving a rune stone wasn't cheap. It required a skilled rune master, time, and a hefty piece of stone, usually granite or sandstone. But the reward was eternity. To raise a rune stone was to say this life mattered. This person will not be forgotten. Even centuries later, their words still speak across time. Some rune stones included images, ships, weapons, animals, or symbols of power. Others were more abstract, twisting runes into serpent shapes or dragon curves. The artistry was as much a statement as the message itself. In a world of oral tradition, where most stories were passed by voice, the rune stone was a physical anchor, an unignorable reminder carved into the world itself. For all their strength and stoicism, the Vikings had one lingering fear that fire, stone, or sword couldn't easily solve the dead who wouldn't stay dead. Because in Norse belief, not all spirits departed peacefully. Some lingered, some returned, and some refused to leave at all. These were the Draga restless dead, who rose from their graves with bloated bodies, glowing eyes, and a very bad attitude. They weren't airy ghosts. They were corporeal, dangerous, and spiteful, known to crush bones, break doors, and sometimes sit on sleeping people like a sweaty boulder of vengeance. The Viking version of a horror movie. Except you might actually know the guy from your village. What caused a person to become a drag? Usually a bad death or a bad life. Greedy, violent, or dishonorable people were prime candidates. So were those who had unfinished business, jealousy, revenge, a sore debt, or just a deep hatred for their relatives. A poorly executed funeral could also result in an unhappy spirit if the burial rites weren't performed properly. Or if the grave goods were stolen, the dead might decide to check back in. To prevent this, Viking funerals included protective rituals. Sometimes the body was buried with heavy stones placed on top to literally pin it down. Other graves show signs of being pierced with spears or stakes, a just-in-case strategy that would make any modern vampire hunter proud. In cremations, the body was burned thoroughly, not just for purification, but to destroy the form the Draugr could return in. But not all lingering dead were evil. Some were ancestral spirits, offering guidance or watching over family lands. These spirits, called Filgr or Disir, could be protective if treated respectfully. They were often honored with seasonal offerings and quiet prayers at burial sites. Even the afterlife wasn't free from tension. A warrior's soul might spend eternity fighting in Valhalla, which sounds glorious until you realize it's a forever war with no weekends. The Vikings embraced the idea of struggle, even after death. Ultimately, death was never just an ending. It was a beginning, a warning, haunting, and a story. The dead were never fully gone. They lingered in smoke, in song, in stone, and sometimes in footsteps you didn't expect to hear behind you. Tonight we begin with the brilliance of the Mongol Empire, built by Genghis Khan, the man who rose from a kidnapped orphan with trust issues to the leader of the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've just woken up somewhere near the Onon River. You're wrapped in wool that smells like a damp yak. The sun hasn't risen, and neither has your sense of direction. There's frost on your boots, a thin layer of ice in your nose, and the sound of something snorting far too close to your head. It's your horse. Of course it is. He's your bedmate, your ride, your heating system, and occasionally your lunch. Personal space is not a concept here. He breathes heavily on you and steps on your coat while you try to stand. He does not apologize. Mongol horses never apologize. Your camp is already in motion. No one speaks. They just mount up and ride off like smoke. A boy with a bow the length of his body gallops past you, yawning. He looks about 10. His saddle is older than he is. He's been riding longer than you've been conscious. You tighten your sash, pack your gear, and climb onto your horse. There's no stirrup ceremony, no deep breath of gratitude, no breakfast. You chew dried meat while riding. If your jaw isn't strong, it will be by tomorrow, assuming there is a tomorrow. The wind cuts sideways. It's not wind for decoration. It's the kind that flays the unprepared. You're riding into it at full gallop. Your face goes numb by the third ridge. No one notices. No one asks if you're okay. This is the step. You are either riding or you are part of the landscape. By midday, you've switched horses twice. Not because you're tired. The horse is. You're expected to be harder than your animal. If the horse is struggling, you carry more. This is considered balance. You urinate from horseback. You eat from horseback. You fight from horseback. If you fall off, you will be trampled. If you stop moving, you will be left. If you complain, no one will listen. They'll just assume the wolves got you early. You ride because everyone rides. Because there are no roads, no destinations, only speed and survival. And because in the Mongol Empire, walking is for prisoners, you are not a prisoner yet. You've survived the ride. You're not dead. That's good. But now you're hungry. Which is a shame, because breakfast here isn't a meal. It's a dare. Someone hands you a leather sack. It sloshes. That's your morning beverage. Fermented mare's milk. It's white, sour, slightly fizzy, and smells like what a saddle feels like after 3 weeks of riding through war zones. You drink it anyway. Not because you want to, because that's what there is. It's called Eric. It's technically alcoholic, but not the fun kind of alcohol. The kind that reminds you bacteria are real, and they live in your throat now. Mongol children drink this. So do warriors. So do grandmothers. If it burns going down, that's how you know it's working. Food. There might be a hunk of dried mutton. Maybe. It's gray, shriveled, and so tough you could use it to resolve your boots. You chew it for 20 minutes. It doesn't get smaller. It just becomes wetter. There's also some curd, a rock-hard sun-dried dairy lump that could double as a projectile weapon. It tastes like sour dust, feels like gravel, and makes your teeth question their purpose. You consider crying, but your tears freeze before they fall. You sit on the ground because there are no tables, no chairs, no napkins, just wind, wool, and the distinct scent of someone boiling something with hooves in it. There are no forks, no spoons, just your hands and the silent judgment of the old man across from you who's already finished his meal, tied a new knot in his saddle rope, and is now sharpening a blade with the kind of intensity usually reserved for religious experiences. You eat what's given. You don't ask what it is. That's a good way to stop being given food. There's no chatting. Mongols don't waste time with pleasantries before battle or after, or during meals. They eat like they ride fast, quiet, and prepared to move at any moment. You try to match their pace. You fail. The mutton fights back. You're not full. You're not satisfied, but you're slightly less starving. In the Mongol Empire, that's a win. It's mid-morning now. The horses are sweating. So are you. And you may be wondering, when you wash? You don't. In the Mongol Empire, clean is not about soap or baths. It's about not dying from infection. And even that's negotiable. You smell like leather, horse meat smoke, and the faint sourness of whatever your boots are made from. Everyone else does too. No one comments. If you show up smelling like flowers, you're either a spy or cursed. Possibly both. Water is for drinking, not bathing. You want to scrub yourself clean with river water. That's drinking water. You want to die of dysentery with soft skin? Go ahead. Otherwise, wipe your face with your sleeve and move on. There is no soap. There is animal fat. There is ash. There is sand. If you want to exfoliate, rub your face with a handful of dust and pretend it's a spa. Your hands are filthy. Your nails are weapons. Your hair hasn't seen water in months. But it's tied neatly under your cap because appearance still matters. Just not the clean kind. The greasy kind. That's respected. You don't remove lice. You manage them. You name them. You flick them into the fire during evening conversation. If they bite too much, you smear yourself with animal fat and dare them to keep going. Clothing. It's wool. It's stiff. It's been worn for 3 winters and still has blood on it from a goat you vaguely remember arguing with. You don't change it. You layer it. Add more in winter. Peel it off in summer. Maybe. Underwear doesn't exist. Neither does shame. And your teeth? They are your own problem. No brushes. No rinses. You chew bones. You drink airrack. You hope the acidity of your breakfast slowly dissolves whatever's stuck between your molars. You keep a knife handy. Not for enemies, but for when that one tooth decides it's done being in your head. So no, you don't get a bath. You get wind. You get horse sweat. You get an overwhelming bouquet of unwashed humanity. But look on the bright side. No one else can smell you over themselves. Now that you've unlearned everything you knew about hygiene, it's time to ride into your first skirmish. You ride all morning and into the afternoon. You are not told where you're going. You are simply going, and then you see them. A cluster of moving dots on the horizon. Riders like you, but not like you, because they're not here to share fermented milk and stories. They're here to die or make you die. It's flexible. You don't panic. No one panics. Everyone just reaches for their bow. Mongol bows are short, curved, deadly, and somehow heavier than they look. They're made from layers of horn, sinew, and raw intent. They don't forgive mistakes. They don't miss twice. You notch your arrow. Your horse keeps moving. You don't slow down. That would be embarrassing. You twist at the waist, lean into the wind and loose. It flies. So does theirs. Welcome to Mongol warfare. No glorious sword fights, no chivalrous duels. Just arrows. Constant, intelligent, unromantic arrows fired from impossible distances while galloping. You've barely blinked, and 3 of your enemies are already on the ground. 2 more are riding in the wrong direction, possibly reconsidering their entire lifestyle. The trick is movement, always moving. The enemy tries to close in. You retreat, not in fear, but on purpose. The famous feigned retreat. Let them think you're running. Let them chase, then turn around and shoot them in the face. You're part of a dance. Fast, precise, brutal. There's no shouting, no battle cries. Just the snap of bowstrings and the dull thud of impact. You hear a scream. It's short. You don't look back. Your arrows aren't just sharp. They're poison. It's not personal. It's practical. Wound one enemy, and let his comrades waste time dragging him away. Wound 2, and you've stalled their entire flank. Efficiency is more important than honor. You've now fired maybe 50 arrows. You've lost count. That's fine. There's a bag of 70 more hanging from your saddle. You shoot until your fingers blister, then shoot anyway. Because if you stop, you won't have fingers. By sunset, the battle is done. You don't know how many you killed. No one does. No one's counting. Only one thing matters. You're still riding. You don't celebrate. You wipe your blade. You eat, you sleep, and tomorrow you ride again. The battle's over. The sun dips behind the hills. No singing, no parades. Just a crackling fire and the subtle sound of something being dismembered nearby. Dinner. You're expected to eat what you kill. If you didn't kill anything today, don't worry. Someone did. You just have to help prepare it. That means skinning, slicing, searing, or occasionally stabbing the goat again because it's somehow still twitching. The meat is tough. Of course it is. It's from an animal that spent its entire life walking uphill in a snowstorm. You roast it on an iron spit that's been in the family longer than most family members. There are no spices, no salt, no ceremony. If it bleeds less than you, it's ready. You sit in a circle. Chewing quietly, everyone stares into the fire like it owes them money. A warrior beside you gnaws a rib clean, licks the bone, then throws it behind him like it might grow into another goat. The fat is the best part. It's greasy, rich, and absolutely essential to staying alive. Mongols prize fat above all, not for flavor, but because it sticks to your ribs and keeps your soul from freezing at night. You don't question it. You bite into it like it wronged your ancestors. There's no bread, no vegetables, just meat and dairy and something in a wooden bowl that might be soup or might be regretful. If someone hands you a chunk of organ meat, you take it. You eat it. You do not ask what it was in life. Curiosity is a luxury. You are not a noble. You are not a guest. You are a stomach with legs and a knife. After eating, there is no cleanup. The bones go to the dogs, ashes to the wind. You wipe your hands on your cloak, which also double S as a napkin, towel, and winter blanket. Hygiene is still theoretical. Someone belches. This is considered polite. You do it too. Congratulations, you're adapting. Later, when you lie in your felt-wrapped bedroll beside a snoring horse, you'll dream of meat, because that's what tomorrow holds too. And if it doesn't, you'll have to ride further until it does. There's no announcement, no first snowflake drifting poetically from the sky. One night you're sleeping with your boots off. The next your boots are frozen solid, and so is your will to live. Welcome to winter on the steppe. It doesn't get cold, it becomes cold. A creeping, bone-deep, cruel cold that wraps around your ribs and whispers, "You were never meant to be here." The wind doesn't howl, it bites. It has teeth and they're sharp, and they aim for your ears. Your breath turns to fog, then to ice, then to regret. You sleep with your horse now. Not near your horse, with your horse. You press your back against its side like it's a lover made of hay and muscle. You'd say it's awkward, but at least it's warm. Clothing becomes a game of layers, wool over wool, over leather, over fur. You stop feeling your fingers by mid-morning. You stop feeling your toes the day after. You try not to think about it. If they come back, great. If not, fewer things to stub. There's no firewood, no forest, just frozen dung. You burn it without question. It smells like betrayal, but it's heat. The smoke curls around your face and makes your eyes water. You blink and your eyelashes freeze together. You are now part sculpture. Your waters, your food, your nose, bleeding. You ride anyway. Mongols don't stop for the weather. If it's not an arrow or a play, it's not worth mentioning. You ride with snow in your boots and wind in your bones, and nobody cares. Especially not the horses who seem to enjoy it. The cold changes you. It takes your voice, dries your skin, and rewrites your personality to something quieter, stiffer, and much less optimistic. You stop complaining, not out of stoicism, but because your jaw refuses to move. And yet you keep moving. Because if you stop, you'll freeze. And if you freeze, someone will bury you under a cairn of stones and ride off without breaking stride. The Empire doesn't wait for spring. Neither do you. He doesn't look like a legend. He sits cross-legged on a plain wooden platform. chewing a piece of dried meat with all the ceremony of a bored butcher. His fur-lined coat is weather-beaten. His beard is uneven. His boots have blood on them, though whether it's from battle, a goat, or last week's argument with a tax collector is unclear. This is your Khan, your general, your leader, the man who can order entire cities wiped from the map with a raised eyebrow. You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not make eye contact for too long. You definitely do not correct his pronunciation, even if he calls you that one with a hair for 6 months straight. He speaks softly. Mongol leaders don't shout. If you can't hear him, that's your problem. Listen harder or read his tone, or follow the sound of your own heartbeat because it's now louder than his voice. Orders are short, precise, absolute. Ride here. Burn this. Accept tribute. Behead the messenger. Don't return until it's done. You nod. Everyone nods. Even the tough ones. The warriors who once outran a siege fire nod like nervous school children. One man coughs during the briefing. He is now gone. No one mentions him again. Your Khan doesn't care about your feelings. He cares about results. Did the city fall? Did you bring back tribute? Is the caravan moving? Are the horses fed? If the answer to any of these is no, you'd better be holding your severed arm as an excuse. His tent is not lavish, but it holds maps. So many maps, all hand-drawn, all annotated in a scrawl that looks like a falcon learned calligraphy. You understand none of it. He understands all of it. He sees rivers as roads, mountains as slight inconveniences, and kingdoms as small prizes wrapped in bad diplomacy. You receive your orders. You leave. You do not ask questions. You do not linger. You saddle your horse and you ride out into the cold again. Because in the Mongol Empire, leadership is not about charisma. It's about survival. And those who question the Khan rarely get the chance to do it twice. You ride into a foreign land, carrying a message. You are not a soldier today. You are an ambassador. This does not mean you are safe. You ride with a small entourage, a flag of truce, and the smug confidence of someone who knows that behind you are thousands of warriors who will happily burn an entire civilization to the ground if your letter is not well received. The letter itself is simple, direct, a few short lines scrawled in Mongolian, Persian, maybe Chinese, depending on the poor soul receiving it. It reads something like, "Submit to us," or "Don't. We'll be back either way." It's sealed with the Khan's mark, a bit of hardened wax that might as well be soaked in gasoline, considering what follows a refusal. You ride into cities with marble gates, golden domes, silk curtains, and nervous guards. You are fed. You are questioned. You are stared at like a hungry wolf that's somehow been invited to dinner. You are polite. You are calm. You explain slowly that submission is in everyone's best interest. Mongol protection comes with benefits. Trade, order, slightly fewer massacres. Refusal comes with fire, arrows, and a thorough removal of anything shaped like a building. Sometimes they say yes. They offer tribute. Horses, gold, daughters. You nod, you leave, you report back. That city stays standing for now. Sometimes they hesitate. They whisper behind closed doors. They send you back with vague answers and suspiciously generous gifts. You accept them. You smile. You note everything. And sometimes they kill the messenger. This is unfortunate for them. You are not avenged with a complaint. You are avenged with siege engines, horse archers, psychological warfare, and a creative use of severed heads as decorative warning signs. Diplomacy is fast in the Mongol Empire. One message, one chance, no second letters, no passive-aggressive negotiations. You deliver the will of the Khan. If it's ignored, his reply arrives strapped to the back of 40,000 mounted archers and a few very enthusiastic engineers. You don't argue, you don't negotiate, you deliver. And if the world listens, it lives. You've ridden into what passes for a Mongol capital. You were expecting towers, maybe walls, some kind of palace with polished floors and a guy in a hat offering figs. What you find instead is a swarm of yurts, felt domes, dozens, hundreds. They stretch across the plains like mushrooms after rain. No stone, no marble, just wool smoke and the smell of boiled something. This is Karakorum, the capital. The beating heart of an empire that spans from the Korean peninsula to the edge of Europe. And it looks like someone lost a sheep convention in the wind. But make no mistake, it functions. Yurts aren't huts. They're portable command centers. Every single one can be taken down in an hour and rebuilt by nightfall. You can burn a city. You can't burn something that's already gone by morning. The Khan's yurt is larger than the rest. Its doorway faces south. Always. You do not enter without invitation. Inside there's felt, furs, scrolls, and a throne that looks less like a seat of power and more like a sturdy place to survive the siege of guests. People come here from all corners of the empire. Traders from Baghdad, princes from Kiev, spies from the Song dynasty, all sitting cross-legged, drinking mare's milk, pretending not to notice the woman in the corner who just disassembled a deer with a spoon. There's no bureaucracy in the European sense. No towers full of scribes. There's just a man with a memory like a steel trap and a few assistants who write things down using bone styluses in a tone of mild terror. Laws are spoken. Decrees are sent out on horseback. Paper is valuable. Ink is expensive. Mistakes are fatal. And yet, the streets are clean. The roads are safe. The trade routes run like blood vessels. There's no poverty because there's no room for it. You're either useful or you're on a horse somewhere being made useful. This isn't Rome. This isn't Baghdad. This is the Mongol answer to urban civilization. Mobile, brutal, efficient. No spires, no statues. I just felt fire. And the knowledge that the entire city could vanish by sunrise and reappear 5 valleys away, like it was never there at all. You steal a horse. You're hungry. You're cold. It looks unattended. You think it's just a quick ride. Maybe 2 miles, maybe 3. You'll bring it back, probably. They catch you before you hit the tree line. Now you're on your knees in front of a man with a mustache so sharp it might count as a weapon. He's not angry. He's not shouting. He's just pointing at the horse, then at you, then at a nearby rock. Flat, broad, execution ready. You're about to learn something important. There are no jails. No appeals, number 16-step legal process. Justice in the Mongol Empire comes in 2 forms, repayment or removal. If you steal, you repay double if you can. If you can't, something else gets taken. A finger, hand, occasionally your head. Depending on the mood and the market value of what you try to steal, you plead your case. Briefly, Mongols believe in clarity. If you talk too long, they assume you're lying. You shorten your explanation to 3 words and hope they count as a character reference. The elders discuss. One of them spits. Another one shrugs. Then they nod. Verdict. You live. Sentence. You walk. As in, you no longer ride. The horse is gone. You now follow the caravan on foot until your honor is considered untarnished, which may take a season or several. No one gives a timeline. Mongols aren't sentimental about rehabilitation. You're either punished or not. After that, they expect you to keep up. Murder. Punishable by death, unless it was a justified blood feud, in which case you owe the family livestock, labor, or a wife. Preferably all 3. Lying to your commander? Death. Harming a fellow Mongol death. Harming a foreigner under protection. Double death with extra ceremony. On the other hand, honesty, courage, and generosity, respected deeply. Even if you smell like fermented despair and ride like a sack of potatoes, if you speak the truth and keep your word, you are considered worth feeding. Mongol law is harsh, but it's fast, predictable, and impossible to bribe. You know where you stand. Usually in front of someone with a sword. And if your conscience is clean, so are your hands. Mostly the scouts return. No one speaks. They just nod toward the west, where smoke rises like a promise. It's a city walled, fortified, the kind of place that believes its gates and guards mean something. That's adorable. You ride out at dawn. Behind you are engineers with carts full of surprises. Ropes, axes, fire pots, collapsible siege equipment, the Mongol version of party favors. There is no grand speech, no blessing, no drum roll, just a few hand signals and the subtle sound of 5,000 men reaching for their bows. First, you circle. Always circle. You what? You note weaknesses. A crooked tower, a badly placed gate, a section of wall that looks like it's seen better centuries. You whisper observations to your captain, who grunts and scratches something into the dirt with a dagger. Then the noise begins. Screams, horns, fire. You don't go straight in. You wait. Let panic do the work. Let the citizens trip over each other while deciding whether to hide the gold or bury the children. Every second they hesitate, your engineers get closer with their ladders and their perfectly polite catapults. Walls. Not a problem. Mongols build siege towers on site using materials from the landscape. Trees, rocks, occasional furniture from a recently evacuated monastery. You don't carry equipment, you carry confidence. The archers create a storm. It's not a volley, it's a weather system. Arrows blacken the sky and rain down with the soft thick of progress. Then you ride in, you hit the gate. Not like a hammer. Like wind with teeth. You spill through the breach, blades drawn, horses foaming, eyes narrowed. Not from rage, but calculation. This is not madness. This is math. Every alley you clear is one step closer to the granary. Every corner you conquer is logistics. You don't loot for greed. You loot for supply. And when it's done, when the towers fall and the banners are pulled down, you don't gloat. Your inventory. Who surrendered? Who resisted? Who is useful? Who is decorative? The rest vanish swiftly, efficiently. And by nightfall, the city is Mongoling you. You're already making plans to be somewhere else tomorrow. The banners are up. The bodies are down. The city is quiet now. The kind of quiet that comes after everyone realizes who's in charge. You. You, the conqueror. You, the horse who breathed outside, who was elbow deep in a siege engine this morning, and is now reviewing tax codes over goat stew. Because that's how it works. In the Mongol Empire, conquest isn't the end. It's the onboarding phase. The locals peek out from shattered windows and ruined temples, expecting the usual pillage, plunder, decades of burning resentment instead. They're greeted by a man in a fur coat holding a list of professions. The Mongols don't destroy everything, only the things that resist. The rest catalog. If you're a blacksmith, you stay. If you're a weaver, same. If you're a scholar, congratulations. You now work for a man who's never read a book, but understands exactly how many arrows it takes to erase a library. There's no formal government structure. There's you and a few scribes, and a mountain of Mongol common sense. You appoint officials, preferably locals, who understand the language and know how not to get stabbed during tax collection. Laws are simple. Obey the code. Pay what you owe. Don't cause trouble. If that sounds vague, don't worry. Enforcement is very clear. One warning, then rope. Trade routes are reopened by noon. Toll stations are manned by evening. And the market is already selling roasted fish like nothing happened, because commerce is the empire's second religion, right after horses. You don't impose your culture. You don't build statues. You just make sure the grain gets counted and the caravans leave on time. Mongol rule is not about identity. It's about efficiency. You can keep your temples and your customs, just not your rebellion. A tax is levied, census takers move in, and by week's end, the same people who were screaming yesterday are now grateful the roads are safer. You conquer them, yes, but you also improve delivery times. You're riding W now, further W than you've ever gone. Past the familiar pastures, past the cities you helped sack, past even the yurts with familiar insults carved into them. This is the frontier, the ragged edge of the empire, where the air is thin and the rumors are thick. No one gives you directions. Directions are for people with roads. What you get are gestures. A shrug toward a mountain, a vague wave past a smoking valley, and the eternal Mongol compass. Follow the bones out here. You ride past things the Empire hasn't yet decided whether to acknowledge. Strange stone towers, half-built forts abandoned mid-hammer, trees with ribbons tied around them. Gifts for gods who've clearly stopped answering mail. You pass a monastery with its doors ripped off. Inside there's incense and silence. A monk bows to you, offers you tea, and doesn't flinch when you track mud across his sacred floor. He's seen your kind before. He knows what happens when someone says no. Then come the rumors, whispers about ghost armies, about cities that vanished overnight, about a mountain pass where Khan's brother disappeared and came back 2 years later, smiling and never blinking again. You don't believe most of it, but you ride slower anyway. At night, you camp in silence. No fires, no laughter. Just you, your horse, and the sound of wolves having theological debates nearby. You wrap your cloak tighter and check your blade twice, not because of bandits, but because of stories that start with no one who rode this way. Even your horse is uneasy. It whinnies in the shadows. And this is a horse that's eaten human flesh and napped through thunder. The edge of the Empire isn't marked by fences. It's marked by atmosphere, a thinning of command, a stretching of logic. Out here, the Khan's word arrived late and often whispered. Still, your orders are clear. Scout, observe, return. You do all three in that order. You take note of every strange village, every half-finished temple, every field where the grass grows sideways. And when you turn back towards civilization, you feel the Empire behind you. Heavy, brutal, real. The edge didn't swallow you. This time you've returned not in glory exactly, but in one piece, which in Mongol terms is practically sainthood. Your horse is thinner. Your boots are bloodstained. Your teeth are fewer. But your scroll pouch is full. Names, maps, tribute tallies, the occasional sketch of a fortress that looked at you funny. You hand it over. A scribe nods. A commander grunts. The Empire continues. And someday, far from here, in a quiet European library or a distracted Chinese court, someone will open a scroll and frown at your name. They will not pronounce it correctly. They will not understand the abbreviations. They will look at the numbers you counted with frozen fingers after 3 days without sleep and say these must be exaggerated because history has a funny habit. It smooths out the parts that make it nervous, and the Mongol Empire makes historians very nervous. They will call you barbarians, savages, a horde, as if you were all one blur of horses and arrows with no trade routes, no diplomats, no legal system carved in blood and common sense. They'll forget the engineers, the postal system, and religious tolerance. They'll remember the sieges. Who wouldn't? But not the fact that you asked cities to surrender before flattening them, that you offered peace, order, and lower toll fees. They'll paint your face twisted in rage, never showing the months you spent negotiating over water rights with a man who bathed once per decade. They'll turn your pragmatic governance into chaos, your brutal discipline into madness, your efficient conquest into random destruction. And they'll conveniently ignore the part where their own kingdoms crumbled from within long before you showed up with a torch and a tactical plan. But you don't care because you weren't building a legacy. You were building roads, real ones. You were making the Empire's answer for their walls. You were making the world smaller, one hoofbeat at a time. And if the world remembers you only as a shadow from the east, that's fine. Charlemagne's exact birthplace is as mysterious as a monk's tax records. Some say he was born in her stall. Others argue for Archon or Ingelheim. The truth is, in the mid-8th century, nobody bothered with birth certificates, especially not for future emperors. What we do know is this. Around 742, a boy was born to Pepin the Short and Bertrada of Leon, and that boy would end up defining medieval Europe. Now, Pepin was no ordinary Frankish noble. He had recently pulled off one of the slickest political coups of the age. He deposed the Merovingian puppet king Childeric I and secured papal blessing to crown himself king of the Franks. That means little Charlemagne was born not just into a powerful family, but into a dynasty that had just reinvented the concept of legitimate rule. Charlemagne's early childhood wasn't spent chasing frogs in a meadow. He was being prepped for war, rule, and theology, sometimes all at once. Frankish education wasn't exactly poetry and philosophy. It was heavy on swords prayer and how to keep unruly nobles from stabbing you in your sleep. His tutor, possibly a man named Fulrad, who was less story time at bedtime and more recited these Latin prayers or felt my wrath. We don't know much about young Charlemagne's personality. He didn't leave a diary, and his biographer, Einhard, wrote about him the way a fanboy writes about a celebrity crush. But one thing is clear. Even in his youth, Charlemagne stood out. Not just because he was over 6 feet tall in an age when 5 feet was impressive, but because he took to leadership like a duck to water, or more accurately, like a Frank to conquest. By the time his father died in 768, Charlemagne was more than ready to inherit the kingdom. Well, half of it. In true medieval fashion, the realm was split between him and his brother Carloman. Sharing power never works well in monarchies or at family dinners. So naturally, tension started simmering. But for now, Charlemagne was officially king, young, ambitious, and already eyeing a Europe that hadn't been united since Rome. The crown was on his head, the sword was in his hand, and Europe was about to meet its new architect. Charlemagne's first challenge as king wasn't a foreign invasion or rebellious noble. It was Carloman, his younger brother, the other guy with a crown. Pepin the Short, in all his wisdom, had split the Frankish kingdom in half, giving Charlemagne the western part and Carloman the eastern. In theory, this was supposed to be a peaceful joint venture. In practice, it was a passive-aggressive disaster with swords. The brothers didn't get along at all. Their territories were technically allied, but their courts operated like rival war camps. Carloman was suspicious, prideful, and possibly just plain difficult. Charlemagne, on the other hand, was already showing signs of being a ruthless strategist and wasn't about to let baby brother clip his wings. Tensions escalated over petty slights and political maneuvering. One particularly telling moment came when Charlemagne was called to help suppress a rebellion in Aquitaine. Instead of joining forces, Carloman refused to send troops. Classic little brother move. Sit back, let big bro do all the fighting, then sulk when he gets the credit. Now into this delicate mess walked Desiderius, the king of the Lombards in northern Italy. He offered Charlemagne a marriage alliance with his daughter in exchange for peace and cooperation. Charlemagne, ever the opportunist, said sure and married her. Carloman, he saw this as a betrayal. Desiderius had once supported their father, and now Charlemagne was cozying up to him. The situation was a medieval soap opera, and just when things were about to boil over, Carloman died conveniently. In 771, barely 3 years into their dual reign, Carloman suddenly kicked the royal bucket at the age of 20. Cause of death? Natural, according to official sources, which in medieval terms could mean anything from pneumonia to he looked at someone the wrong way. Charlemagne wasted no time. He moved into his brother's territory like a man who'd been planning it since day one. Carloman's widow and children fled to guess who? Desiderius, who was now fuming. So Charlemagne now had all of Francia under his rule. No more brother, no more cooking. Just one man, one crown, and a growing list of enemies. And next on that list, the in-laws. Now that Carloman was out of the picture, Charlemagne had a kingdom to himself and a problem in Italy. Specifically, Desiderius, king of the Lombards. You know, the guy whose daughter Charlemagne had married and then very quietly divorced the moment Carloman died. Awkward. Desiderius was not pleased to make matters worse. He had taken in Carloman's widow and sons, and was now openly supporting their claim to Charlemagne's throne. That's not just annoying in medieval politics. That's basically a declaration of war with a bow on it. Charlemagne didn't hesitate. In 773, he marched his army across the Alps. And no, this wasn't some summer stroll through the mountains. Crossing the Alps meant snow, narrow passes, and the occasional unexpected avalanche. But Charlemagne did it anyway, because Charlemagne didn't let mountains, family drama, or bad weather stop him from getting what he wanted. Once he reached Italy, Charlemagne laid siege to Pavia, the Lombard capital. Desiderius dug in for the long haul. Unfortunately for him, Charlemagne had the patience of a monk copying scripture. He surrounded the city and waited. Months passed, supplies dwindled, morale plummeted. By 774, Pavia surrendered, and Charlemagne didn't just win a war. He took the Lombard crown for himself. That's right, he didn't install a puppet ruler or play nice with local nobility. He simply declared himself king of the Lombards. That made him ruler of both the Franks and the Lombards, a medieval power move so bold it echoed all the way to Rome. Speaking of Rome, the Pope Adrian I had been nervously watching all of this from the Vatican like a bishop holding his breath during a chess match. Desiderius had threatened the Papal States before, and the Pope had hoped Charlemagne would come to the rescue. Charlemagne did, and in return he received the Pope's blessing and a convenient alliance with the Church that would last for decades. The Lombard campaign wasn't just a family feud turned conquest. It was a statement. Charlemagne wasn't playing by the old tribal rules anymore. He was building an empire, and now he had the backing of God's representative on earth, which made it a lot harder for anyone to say no to him. With Italy under control and the Pope sending warm regards, Charlemagne turned his gaze in toward the Saxons. These weren't courtly nobles sipping wine. These were pagan tribes, wild, warlike, and deeply allergic to Christianity, and they had been poking at the Frankish borders for years. Raiding villages and disrespecting everything holy, Charlemagne had had enough. Starting in 772, he launched a campaign that would become his most infamous, the Saxon Wars. Not a single war, mind you, but 18 separate campaigns spread over 30 years because the Saxons, bless their forest-dwelling hearts, refused to roll over. At first it went well. Charlemagne stormed into Saxony, burned down the sacred Irminsul, basically their holy tree, and declared time to be Christian folks. The Saxons responded the way any proud warrior people would. They smiled politely, said sure, no problem, and then immediately rebelled the moment his army left. This happened repeatedly. Charlemagne would march in, crush resistance, baptize a few thousand terrified locals at sword point, and leave. Then the Saxons would torture church, kill the priests, and go back to worshipping their old gods. The most notorious moment came in 782. After a major rebellion, Charlemagne ordered the massacre of Verdun, executing around 4,500 Saxons in a single day. It was brutal, even by medieval standards, and it sent a message. Conversion wasn't optional. It was mandatory. Now, Charlemagne didn't just want obedience. He wanted spiritual obedience. He genuinely believed it was his Christian duty to save souls, even if those souls were being saved through fire and steel. Monks followed his armies. Churches were built as quickly as fortresses. And any Saxon who refused baptism, well, let's just say the baptismal font came with backup swords. But for all his efforts, the Saxons just wouldn't stay conquered. The forests of northern Germany became a graveyard for Frankish soldiers and a test of Charlemagne's patience. Year after year, revolt after revolt, the war dragged on. Charlemagne wasn't just a sword-swinging conqueror. He also had a soft spot for books. Yes, this man who spent decades stomping Saxons into reluctant baptism also launched one of Europe's most important educational revivals. Welcome to the Carolingian Renaissance, a movement less about oil painting and more about making sure monks knew how to spell. You see, Charlemagne had a problem. His empire was growing faster than anyone could govern it, and the priests, nobles, and officials he relied on were, how shall we put this, functionally illiterate. The administration was becoming a game of medieval telephone, and even the Bible was getting creatively interpreted. So Charlemagne did something radical. He declared that education mattered. He invited the best scholars in Europe to his court. Chief among them was Alcuin of York, a no-nonsense Anglo-Saxon intellectual, who probably viewed bad Latin the way modern editors view Comic Sans. Under Alcuin's guidance, Charlemagne founded palace schools, set curriculum standards, and insisted that monasteries double as classrooms. And this wasn't just for nobles. Charlemagne wanted everyone, priests, scribes, and even peasants, to have at least a shot at learning how to read and write. In Latin, of course. Because what's the point of being educated if you can't read the Vulgate? Ironically, despite pushing education so hard, Charlemagne himself was barely literate. He could speak several languages, but reading, writing. Hey, he tried to learn. There are stories of him keeping wax tablets under his pillow to practice writing at night. But ruling an empire didn't exactly leave much time for penmanship. Still, Charlemagne led by example. He valued knowledge. He respected scholars. He even standardized handwriting. Yes, Carolingian minuscule, that clean, readable script that modern fonts still copy, what is doing. Before that, manuscripts looked like someone spilled ink while having a seizure. Thanks to his efforts, thousands of ancient texts were preserved. Monks began copying manuscripts like their lives depended on it, because sometimes they did. Literacy rates improved. The church became more coherent. And Europe took one cautious step out of the Dark Ages. It was Christmas Day, 800 AD. The streets of Rome were cold, the churches packed, and Charlemagne was attending Mass in St. Peter's Basilica like a good Christian king. Or at least that's what everyone thought, until Pope Leo III pulled off one of the most theatrical surprise moves in medieval history. As Charlemagne knelt in prayer, the Pope suddenly placed a golden crown on his head and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. Just like that. No warning. No formal ceremony. Not polite. Hey, Charles, do you maybe want to be emperor? No. Just boom. Instant empire. Historians still argue over whether Charlemagne knew this was going to happen. Some say it was staged. Others say it caught him off guard. Charlemagne himself later claimed he would never have entered the church had he known, which is a very emperor thing to say. Either way, the symbolism was enormous. The Roman Empire had fallen back in 476. Now, over 3 centuries later, the Pope was effectively resurrecting it with Charlemagne as its new head, a Frankish king crowned by the church, ruling over a patchwork of Germanic tribes, Lombards, and Latin-speaking clergy. The Holy Roman Empire was born. Although that name wouldn't be used for a while, this moment shifted everything. Charlemagne's authority was no longer just military. It was spiritual, divine. He was now seen as the successor to the Caesars, a Christian Caesar, with the Pope as both ally and spiritual referee. But not everyone was thrilled. The Byzantines over in Constantinople had been calling themselves Roman emperors for centuries, and did not appreciate some Frankish upstart playing emperor in the West. For decades, diplomatic relations were tense, with titles flung around like insults and treaties scribbled under duress. Back home, though, the title stuck. Charlemagne reigned as emperor until his death in 814, and the imperial dignity gave weight to everything he did, from issuing laws to reforming the church. It was the capstone of his rule. A crown not just made of gold, but of legitimacy, myth, and historical theater. Conquering half of Europe is impressive, keeping it running without the whole thing collapsing into civil war. That's the real magic trick. And Charlemagne, oddly enough, managed it not just through blood and steel, but with ink, messengers, monks, and a medieval version of spreadsheets. Once he was emperor, Charlemagne got serious about governance. He knew he couldn't be everywhere at once, so he started building a system that looked suspiciously like an early version of modern bureaucracy, just with more Latin and slightly fewer bribes. Probably at the heart of his administration were the Missi Dominici, literally the Lord's envoys me. These were trusted officials, always sent in pairs, usually one noble and one bishop, who traveled around the empire delivering royal orders, inspecting local lords, and making sure no one was quietly building their own little kingdom in the backwoods. Think of them as medieval auditors, only with swords and divine backing. Local counts and dukes still ruled their regions, but they answered Charlemagne. And if they didn't, well, a friendly visit from a missus. Dominicus could quickly turn into a career-ending conversation. Charlemagne didn't show tolerance when it came to disloyalty. He also introduced capitularies, written laws and instructions that applied across the empire. These covered everything from how to run a monastery to how many soldiers a noble had to provide, to what kind of bread should be served at imperial banquets. Yes, even bread regulation, because you can't have an empire falling apart over badly baked loaves. But this wasn't just micromanagement for its own sake. Charlemagne believed in order, Christian order, and to him a stable, well-run empire reflected divine favor. His laws weren't just legal, they were moral. He wanted a society where everyone knew their role, paid their taxes to the church and to him, and prayed at the proper time, preferably under a roof he had personally authorized. It wasn't perfect. Corruption still existed. Communication was slow, and sometimes local lords quietly ignored orders when no one was watching. But for a man ruling over a territory that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, it worked surprisingly well. By the early 800s, Charlemagne's empire was the biggest Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. From modern-day France and Germany to northern Italy and parts of Central Europe, his domain stretched across cultures, languages, and weather patterns that could give a bishop frostbite in July. The man ruled over Catholics, pagans, semi-Christianized tribes, ambitious nobles, and moody bishops. And somehow he kept them all more or less in line. On the surface, things looked glorious. The Carolingian Renaissance was in full swing. Monasteries were copying books like caffeinated scribes. Law and order had a vaguely uniform shape. Even coins bore Charlemagne's image, glaring sternly in profile, because nothing says I'm in charge like putting your face in every pocket. But beneath the grandeur, cracks were forming. For starters, succession. Charlemagne had many children, at least 18, thanks to a rotating cast of wives and concubines, but only a few were considered politically viable. He had once divided the empire among 3 sons, just like his father had. Then one died, then another. By 806, he was down to one heir, Louis the Pious, the youngest and, well, the most monk-like. Louis was a good Christian, quiet, thoughtful, and kind. In other words, the polar opposite of Charlemagne. When your empire depends on intimidation and iron will, handing it off to someone who prefers psalms over politics feels risky. Then there was the nobility. During Charlemagne's reign, they were kept in check by sheer fear and efficiency. But even then, local counts were getting bolder. Some enforced royal laws with gusto. Others treated them like polite suggestions. The empire was stable, but it was a personality cult, held together by one man's presence and very few backup systems. Add to that the endless wars, constant rebellions, especially from the still not fully subdued Saxons, and the cost of maintaining armies, and the pressure was building. Even the church, while mostly loyal, had its own ambitions. Bishops had political power. Abbots controlled vast lands, and while they blessed Charlemagne's rule with one hand, they sometimes pushed back with the other, especially when royal demands clashed with canon law or monastery budgets. The empire was brilliant, but like all things built at speed and scale, it depended on the one person who could command it all, and that person was getting old. In the winter of 814, Charlemagne fell ill. He was in Aachen, his favored palace city, surrounded by scholars, advisors, and the lingering smell of burned firewood and ink-stained parchment. He was 72, a near miraculous age for a man who'd spent decades fighting wars, crossing mountains, and making sure every noble knew who was boss. Despite his warrior image, his decline was slow and almost quiet. He fasted, prayed, and, as Einhard, his devoted biographer, put it, accepted death with a calm dignity befitting a Christian emperor. On January 28, 814, Charlemagne died. The bells rang. The empire held its breath. They buried him in Aachen Cathedral, beneath a marble throne, wrapped in imperial robes, sword at his side, and a copy of the Gospels in his lap. Not a bad send-off for a man who had once been crowned emperor of the Romans in a surprise ceremony. Later legends would claim he sat upright in his tomb like a sleeping king, ready to rise again if the empire ever needed him. Romantic nonsense, of course, but telling. His only surviving son, Louis the Pious, inherited the whole empire, along with its unwieldy borders, rebellious nobles, and growing unrest. Louis tried to rule well, he really did. But he wasn't his father. The iron grip loosened. Power fragmented. Civil wars broke out. Within a few decades, the grand empire Charlemagne built was split into pieces, eventually giving rise to France and Germany as separate kingdoms. And yet Charlemagne's legacy didn't dissolve with his empire. It grew. He became a mythic figure, Carolus Magnus, the ideal Christian king. Popes invoked his memory. Emperors styled themselves in his image. The Holy Roman Empire, founded long after his death, claimed him as its spiritual father. Even Napoleon, centuries later, modeled his coronation after Charlemagne's, eager to snatch a bit of that old divine glow. Charlemagne didn't just unify Europe. He gave it a blueprint, a fusion of Roman law and Germanic kingship. and Christian faith. He helped drag a continent out of the ruins of the Dark Ages and planted the seeds for the nations that would define it. When he died, the world lost a man, but it gained a legend. And legends, as Europe would prove again and again, are far harder to bury. A medieval feast was not just about eating, it was about being seen. Picture this: long wooden tables draped in cloth, flickering torches casting shadows on stone walls, and the scent of roasted boar mingling with wine, sweat, and ambition. This wasn't dinner, this was theater. And every dish, every seat, every spoonful served was part of carefully choreographed social ritual. In a world where birth determined rank, feasts gave the ruling class a chance to remind everyone of their place. Seating arrangements were political chess moves. The lord and lady sat at the high table, literally elevated, both in furniture and in status. The closer you were seated to them, the more important you were. If you found yourself staring at a drafty wall next to the musicians, you weren't just cold, you were expendable. Food arrived in waves called removes, like acts in a play. The first course might feature stuffed peacocks with their feathers reattached, just for flair. Then came platters of venison, swans, pigeons, and pie crusts, and roasted boars' heads with apples in their mouths. Nothing subtle. If the animal once had a face, it was likely staring back at you now, glazed in wine sauce. And then there were the subtleties. Elaborate, edible sculptures made of sugar, marzipan, or pastry, shaped into castles, saints, mythical creatures, or scenes from biblical epics. These weren't meant to be eaten. They were meant to be admired or gawked at, preferably both. But it wasn't just about flexing wealth. Feasts were political tools. Treaties were negotiated between bites of pheasant. Alliances were solidified over goblets of spiced wine. Marriages were arranged between courses. Hosting a bad feast could ruin a reputation. Hosting a great one that could buy loyalty for years. Even silence had meaning. Guests weren't just allowed to speak freely. Toasts were timed. Music cued conversations. A juggler might perform to distract from an awkward lull. A poet might recite flattery, so syrupy it made the boars seem bland. Behind every grand medieval feast was a scene of pure, beautiful chaos. The castle kitchen. Not your cozy modern space with ceramic countertops and herb gardens. No, this was a smoky, shouting, wood-fired war zone, run by a hierarchy that would make a small army blush. At the top of this culinary command tower stood the master cook, the Gordon Ramsay of his day. Minus the swearing, or with more swearing in Latin, he oversaw dozens of assistants, spit turners, pot boys, pastry makers, fish cleaners, sauce men, and at least one poor soul whose job was just plucking poultry all day. And they weren't whipping up 2 or 3 dishes. They were making hundreds, often without a single written recipe, because cookbooks were rare, handwritten, and kept under tighter lock than some treasure chests. The kitchen fire roared day and night. There were no thermostats, just blistered hands, guesswork, and prayer. Meat was roasted on massive spits turned manually, usually by young boys whose arms never stopped spinning, and the size of the meat. Let's just say a cow might show up in pieces over the course of a 3-day feast. Sauces were vital. Everything was doused in a combination of vinegar, wine, and exotic spices. Not because they were trying to mask rotten food, as the myth says that would have insulted the guests, but because spices were wealth. Saffron, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. These were imported luxuries. Serving them wasn't just about flavor, it was about flexing trade connections. This chicken tastes like cinnamon was basically medieval for unloaded. Bread was a staple, but came in different classes. The nobility got the fine white manchik bread, the servants ate the coarser brown loaves, and under every dish was a trench, a stale piece of bread used as a plate which soaked up all the greasy juices and was then either eaten by the lower classes or thrown to the dogs or both, depending on the dog's manners, the smell. A blend of herbs, meat, yeast, sweat, and fire. The noise? Constant clanging, shouting, and the occasional panicked squawk from a goose that had not yet accepted its fate. It wasn't glamorous, but it was efficient, and without it, the entire illusion of effortless nobility upstairs would have collapsed like a poorly baked pie. If you ever got invited to a medieval feast, congratulations. You were either important, rich, or someone's political porn, but what actually landed on your plate? Let's just say, if you're a picky eater, you might want to look away. Meat ruled the table. Deer, wild boar, rabbit, pheasant, swan, even porpoise if you were dining on a particularly eccentric coastline. Everything that could walk, fly, swim, or vaguely resemble meat was fair game, literally. Hunting was both sport and supply chain. Nobles went out and killed the food they would later brag about while eating it, and the rarer the animal, the higher the status. Whole roasted animals were the stars of the show. Picture an entire pig, snout polished, teeth bared, apple in mouth or swan. Feathers reapplied post-cooking because of the presentation. If it looked dangerous before, it was supposed to look majestic now. But it wasn't just about quantity. The menu was strategic. You didn't dump everything on the table at once. You served it in courses called removes. The first might include lighter fare, soups, small pies, fish if it was Friday, and the church was watching. Later courses escalated to the heavy hitters, roasts, game pies stuffed with meat and spice and more meat. Fish had its own day in the spotlight. Especially during fasting seasons, eels, pike, and herring were frequent guests, sometimes molded into the shapes of animals. They were definitely not. Because why serve boring boiled fish when you can serve a fish that looks like a hedgehog? And the spices? Oh, the spices. Medieval people didn't believe in bland. Cinnamon on chicken? Absolutely. Ginger in gravy? Of course. Sugar on meat? Why not? Sweet and savory lived happily on the same plate, sometimes on the same bite. Vegetables, by contrast, were suspiciously absent from noble plates. Root vegetables and greens were often seen as peasant food. Too humble, too earthy. Lords didn't care for turnips unless they were stuffed into a pastry shaped like a unicorn. By the end of the feast, the menu had gone from tame to theatrical. The goal wasn't to satisfy hunger. The goal was to overwhelm, to dazzle, to leave your guests stuffed, stunned, and maybe just slightly afraid of the next move, because dessert might just be breathing fire. While the food did its job of clogging arteries and signaling wealth, a medieval feast wasn't complete without entertainment, and lots of it. You didn't just eat. You laughed, listened, gawked, and occasionally winced at whatever unfolded between courses. Enter the fool, the court jester clad in bells. Mismatched colors, and enough audacity to insult the host without getting beheaded. Usually the fool's job was to make people laugh, mock the powerful, and provide an air of controlled chaos. They juggled, told bawdy stories, and performed slapstick routines with the finesse of someone who knew that one bad joke could end in unemployment or execution. Then came the minstrels, with their lutes, harps, and voices trained in ballads about love lore. And the occasional dragon music filled the hall, not as background ambience, but as part of the experience. These songs weren't just for mood. They were political commentary, historical records, and flattery disguised as melody. If the lore of the house was featured heroically in the third verse, congratulations, the minstrel would eat well tonight. For something flashier, you had acrobats and fire breathers. Yes, real fire. Indoors, in a wooden hall lined with rushes and tapestries, safety codes were a distant fantasy. Sword swallowers, animal tamers, even dancing bears made appearances, though the bears weren't always thrilled about it. And then there were the subtleties, edible performances, sugar sculptures that doubled as political satire, giant pies with live birds inside, released mid-course for dramatic flair. Nothing said were rich like cutting into a pie and watching doves explode from it, while the guests politely applauded and tried not to get pooped on. Some feasts included morality plays, little theatrical skits about virtue, sin, or the dangers of not respecting the church. These were performed by traveling troops, or occasionally by monks who were far too excited to play the devil. Everything was calculated. Entertainment kept the mood light, distracted from political tension, and ensured that no guest had time to whisper rebellion between sips of mead. A good entertainer could prevent a duel. A bad one might start one. At a medieval feast, you weren't just watching a show. You were the show and the laughter. That was just another way to keep the knives pointed away from the host. In the medieval world, what you ate wasn't nearly as important as who you ate it with. A feast was the medieval version of a press conference. Marriage proposal, court negotiation and corporate takeover rolled into one gloriously greasy event. Hosting a feast wasn't just hospitality, it was strategy. It signaled wealth, power, generosity, and control. And every single element, from seating arrangement to source choice, communicated status. Take seating, for example. The high table wasn't just physically elevated, it was socially radioactive. The lord and lady sat in the center, flanked by their most honored guests, bishops, foreign ambassadors, visiting nobles. If you were anywhere near the salt cellar, you were somebody. Everyone else was, well, just happy to be breathing the same roasted air. That's where we get the term above the salt. You were either close to the host and important, or seated near the floor with the minstrels and empty wine jugs. Invitations weren't handed out like candy. Being summoned to a feast meant you mattered and refused to attend. That was a statement, one that might earn you a visit from armed men asking why your chair was empty. On the flip side, attending the feast of arrival could mean you were switching sides. Every guest list was a political minefield. The food itself carried messages. Serving a particular regional delicacy could flatter a visiting duke. Offering an overabundance of game meant look how vast and well-stocked my lands are. Including foreign spices said I have trade connections you only dream about. Even wine could be loaded with meaning. Was it local, imported, blessed by a bishop? Then there were the gifts. Guests sometimes brought offerings, jewels, relics, horses, and were expected to praise the host in return. Toasts were part flattery, part performance, and sometimes part warning. Feasts were also the stage for alliances. A marriage match could be sealed over honeyed quail, a land dispute resolved by the third move. And if all else failed, a rival lord could be made drunk enough to sign something stupid or too poisoned to wake up the next morning for all its gluttony and grandeur. Medieval feasting was heavily shaped by the one authority even kings didn't mess with, the church. And the church had opinions, strong ones, about what you could eat, when you could eat it, and just how guilty you should feel afterward. In the medieval calendar, there were more fasting days than feasting days. That's not an exaggeration. Nearly half the year was designated for some form of dietary restriction. Wednesdays, Fridays, Lent, Advent, various vigils, you name it. And on these days, meat from land animals was strictly off the table, literally. So, how did the nobility cope? With creativity. They still threw feasts. They just swapped out ingredients. Out went beef, pork, and venison. In came fish, eggs, almonds, and anything that could pretend it wasn't technically meat. Beaver tails, for example, considered fish because they were scaly and aquatic. Problem solved. God's fine with loopholes, right? Dishes became culinary acrobatics. Chefs molded almond milk into imitation cheese. They turned fish into fake roasts. Some meals looked like sin, but technically followed the rules. And of course, wine didn't count as food. It never does. On feast days, celebrating saints or holy events, however, it was open season and the church threw its own festivals too. Easter, Christmas, Epiphany. These weren't just sacred. They were licensed excuses to eat everything in sight. A Christmas feast might stretch for 12 full days, each course bigger and more absurd than the last. Because nothing says Christ is born like a pie with 4 types of bird inside. Monasteries weren't exempt either. Though monks were supposed to live humbly, some abbeys became legendary for their kitchens. A wealthy monastery might fast on oysters and spy steel. Monks developed precise food schedules, including seasonal menus and loophole-heavy substitutions that kept their bellies full and their sins technical. Still, food was a spiritual business. Feasting wasn't just indulgence, it was a divine performance. You gave thanks before you ate, made offerings to the church after, and prayed your cook hadn't served you meat on the wrong Thursday. In the medieval world, gluttony was a sin, but banqueting with holiness? That was practically a sacrament. For all the roasting boars and juggling fools, a medieval feast was not a free-for-all. There were rules, many of them. In fact, if you wanted to keep your status and your seat, you had to know how to behave like a proper, greasy-fingered noble. First rule, don't touch the food like a peasant. Forks weren't widely used yet, so people mostly ate with their fingers. But there was a system to it. You used the first three fingers of your right hand, never your left, unless you wanted to start rumors about witchcraft or poor hygiene. Second, don't lick your fingers until the end of the meal. It was considered perfectly acceptable to rinse your hands in a shared basin between courses, but licking them during dinner? That was low class, like showing up without shoes or being French in an English castle. Every guest had their own knife, which they brought with them. Your host didn't provide cutlery, just food and a place to put it. Your knife wasn't just for cutting. It was a personal statement, like a medieval iPhone. Flashy handle. You're important. Rusty blade. Enjoy sitting by the firewood. Drinking etiquette was its own battlefield. You didn't just guzzle your wine. You toasted. You sipped. You offered the cup to your neighbor, especially if you were angling for a favor, or wanted to politely challenge them to a duel later. And yes, you shared goblets. Germ theory hadn't been invented yet, and everyone was too busy dying from plague to worry about lip contact. Then there was conversation. You were expected to talk, but not too much. Laugh, but not too loudly. Praise the food, but not more than the host. Don't speak with your mouth full unless you're insulting a rival, and don't burp unless you're Mongolian or drunk. Or both. At fancier feasts, hand-washing rituals were practically ceremonial. Servants poured scented water over guest hands, often before the first remove and again before dessert. Not for cleanliness, just to remind everyone how refined they were. Etiquette wasn't about being polite. It was about proving you belonged. One slip, spilled wine, a dirty sleeve, reaching too far across the table, and suddenly you weren't feasting with the Lord. You were back with the dogs, and they didn't share the wine. After the last swan was carved, the final toast was delivered, and the fool escorted out for juggling bread rolls into a bishop's goblet. One question remained. What happened to the food? Medieval feasts produced an obscene amount of it. Boars, pies, jellied fish, sugar castles, and bread trenches soaked in meat drippings. It was more than even the hungriest noble could consume, but waste was a luxury too. What you didn't eat sent just as loud a message as what you served. So where did it all go? If you were lucky, it went to the servants. They ate in shifts after the feast, picking over what remained from the lower tables. Sometimes they'd get choice cuts, especially if a favored guest passed along their untouched roast, or decided not to eat the stuffed hedgehog pastry. It wasn't glamorous, but it beat porridge. The trencher bread, that thick slice acting as a plate, was a special case. Saturated with sauces and grease, it was rarely eaten by the nobles unless they were really drunk. Instead, these soggy slabs were collected and often distributed to the poor. Not out of charity, mind you. It was more like nobles saying, "Here, have the leftovers of our greatness." But if you were a peasant, getting a slab soaked in spiced boar fat was better than a sermon on humility. In monasteries and churches, feast leftovers became alms. Feeding the poor wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. Leftovers were gathered into baskets, blessed probably after the fingers were picked out and handed out as a moral duty. Sometimes the poor were even invited to dine in the Great Hall after the nobles left, those seated in a very different spot, and usually without the juggling bear. Still, not everything went to hungry mouths. Some of it was simply thrown out, fed to pigs, or composted in castle-midden heaps. Why? Because in medieval high society, restraint was overrated. A surplus showed wealth. Letting food spoil quietly behind a kitchen door was just part of the show. So while the nobles sobered up and congratulated themselves on a feast well hosted, life went on for the rest. Servants nibbling bones, peasants lining up for trenches, dogs wrestling over fish heads. Because in the medieval world, even leftovers had a hierarchy. The candles had burned low, the minstrels were snoring under benches, half the guests were face down in pie crusts, and the other half were staggering through castle corridors. Looking for their shoes or dignity, the feast was over, but the morning after, that was a whole different ritual. Cleanup began before the guests even left. Servants moved like ghosts, clearing bones, scraping trenches and sweeping rushes off the floor. Those sweet-smelling herbs scattered to mask the stink of sweat, spilled wine, and noble flatulence. Rushes had to be replaced regularly, especially after a feast where the floor absorbed more than just crumbs. And then came the reckoning. The steward, essentially the medieval party planner, assessed the damage. Broken goblets, missing silverware, a suspicious amount of spilled gravy near the bishop's seat. It all went into the report. Sometimes guests even stole cutlery as a weird badge of honor. If you left with a spoon, it meant you were important enough to dare. The kitchen was a battlefield. Burned pots, cracked platters, and enough grease to oil the drawbridge. Cooks staggered out like survivors, some missing eyebrows from the oven fire, others grumbling about, "Next time we just serve porridge." For the hosts, though, the real work had just begun. The politics of gratitude kicked in. Letters were written, gifts sent, compliments paid. If a powerful guest wasn't properly thanked, or worse, if they were seated too far from the roast swan, grudges could form, and medieval grudges had a way of turning into feuds or wars. Sometimes a feast backfired, a guest insulted, an alliance offended, a drunken noble confessing to treason over mulled wine. One all-time toast could undo months of diplomacy. The feast was a show, yes, but like all theater, the reviews could kill you. For the lower classes, the morning after was business as usual. Some washed dishes, some shoveled refuse. Some got lucky and found a forgotten crust of almond cake behind a dais. That was breakfast. And then, quietly, the castle returned to its rhythm. The banners came down, the dogs were fed, the torches extinguished until the next celebration, coronation, or wedding, or excuse to impress the neighbors. Feasting season was closed, but its echoes lingered, like smoke in the rafters and wine stains on the stone. Because in the medieval world, no one ever forgot a good feast or a bad one. Leif Erikson didn't enter the world quietly. Around the year 970, possibly in Iceland, maybe in Greenland, depending on which saga you're trying to decode. He was born into a family of exile, ambition, and very poor impulse control. His father was Eric the Red, a hot-headed Norwegian outlaw exiled for murder, who then got exiled again from Iceland for, shockingly, more murder. Instead of learning restraint, Eric discovered Greenland. Because if you're going to be banned from one frozen island, why not claim another? Leif grew up in this rugged frontier settlement where winters were cruel, neighbors were scarce, and the only consistent export was stories. Greenland wasn't a thriving colony. It was barely a functioning outpost held together by stubbornness, driftwood, and fish. But it gave Leif something that mattered more than comfort: perspective. He knew what it meant to survive on the edge of the known world. His family was steeped in Norse tradition, hard drinking, hard fighting, and perpetually skeptical of outside authority. Yet even amid this rugged culture, Leif was different. He was curious, reflective, observant. According to the sagas, he was tall, strong, handsome, naturally, and notably more thoughtful than his volatile father. He wasn't raised on scrolls or scholars. He was raised on sagas, oral tales of gods, monsters, voyages, and revenge. These stories weren't bedtime lullabies. They were survival manuals wrapped in mythology, and they seeped into Leif like sea brine into a long ship's hull. Greenland's isolation left young Leif hungry for something more. Unlike his father, whose ambition ended in exile and bloodshed, Leif looked outward toward Iceland, toward Norway, toward the horizon. He listened to old sailors speak of strange lands beyond the ice. He studied the stars, and he watched the tides by the time he reached manhood. He wasn't just the son of Eric the Red. He was a Norseman with a boat, a brain, and a burning need to explore something. Anything that wasn't a freezing rock filled with equally frozen egos. Before he ever sailed W, before the church came calling, before his name landed in sagas and schoolbooks, Leif Erikson was a boy born of fire and ice, destined to outrun both. Leif didn't just drift into greatness, he sailed into it. At some point in his early adulthood, Leif left Greenland behind and traveled to Norway, the old heart of Norse power. It was more than a homecoming. It was a collision with a world far more advanced, hierarchical, and surprisingly holy, because Norway wasn't the same place his father had fled. It was now ruled by King Olaf Tryggvason, a man with a crown, a sword, and a serious fixation on converting the Norse to Christianity, whether they liked it or not. Leif found himself face to face with Olaf, a Christian warrior king who had replaced blood feuds with baptisms and long ships with churches. And unlike many of his countrymen, Leif didn't scoff. He listened. Perhaps it was diplomacy, perhaps curiosity. Or maybe Leif had grown tired of the endless cycle of raids, revenge, and gods who mostly demanded blood and beer, whatever the reason. Leif was baptized, accepted Christianity, and was given a new mission: bring the faith back to Greenland. It wasn't exactly an easy assignment. Imagine trying to explain monotheism to a bunch of farmers who regularly sacrificed goats to Thor when the weather got weird. Greenland was remote, suspicious of outsiders, and still mostly loyal to Odin, Freya, and the rest of the Thunder Happy crew. But Leif didn't return empty-handed. He brought priests, knowledge, and royal support. When he landed in Greenland again, he wasn't just a chieftain's son. He was an emissary of a king, a new god. And while he didn't exactly spark a revival overnight, his influence began to take root. Christianity started spreading in small, icy circles. Chapels were built, crosses were raised. Old gods weren't replaced immediately, but they had serious competition. This marked a turning point. Leif wasn't just a sailor or a settler anymore. He was a cultural bridge, a man between two worlds: Norse tradition and Christian order, pagan legend and written law. He had one foot in Valhalla and the other in Bethlehem, and somewhere between converting his neighbors and maintaining fragile peace, Leif Erikson began hearing tales of strange lands to the west, lands with grapes, forests, and no snow in sight. The next great voyage was calling. Some great discoveries begin with ambition. Others begin with bad navigation. Leif Erikson had set sail from Norway with noble intentions to bring Christianity to Greenland and maybe check in on the family drama while he was at it. But fate, or perhaps the North Atlantic's notoriously moody weather, had other plans, according to the saga of the Greenlanders. Leif heard whispers of a strange land far west, seen years earlier by a man named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had glimpsed unknown shores but never bothered to land. Classic Bjarni, a man who discovered North America and then just kept sailing like he had groceries in the back. Leif, however, was made of different wood. Around the year 1000, he bought Bjarni's ship, gathered a crew, and decided to find out what lay beyond the horizon. He wasn't just sailing into the unknown. He was sailing into legend. The journey was perilous. Icebergs, storms, and the real possibility of falling off the edge of the earth kept things interesting. But Leif was calm, steady, and as the sagas claim, annoyingly competent. Eventually, his ship reached a place very unlike Greenland. First came a barren land he named Helluland, likely modern-day Baffin Island, flat, rocky, and unimpressed. Then Markland, probably Labrador, with forests thick enough to build an entire fleet. Useful, but still not quite the promised land. Finally, Leif arrived at a place so mild, so rich in resources, that his crew named it Finland, the land of wine or grapes, or possibly fermented berries. The sagas are vague, and Norsemen weren't exactly sommeliers. The place was a paradise compared to the icy death trap they called home. They built houses, explored rivers, and enjoyed the novelty of not having to chip. They're drinking water out of a glacier. Leif called the main settlement Leifsbudir, Leifsbus, humble name for a man accidentally making history. He stayed through the winter, mapping the land, gathering timber, and preparing stories that would shake the north once he returned. There were no grand conquests, no wars, just quiet, practical exploration. Surprisingly modern for a Viking. Leif didn't plant flags or declare ownership. He just observed, named, and left. And yet, in doing so, he became the first European to set foot in North America. Before Columbus, before maps, before anyone knew what he'd done, Leif Erikson's landing in Vinland should have been the start of a new Norse golden age. Mild climate, wild grapes, tall timber, no frostbite. What more could a Greenlander ask for? But paradise, as it turns out, comes with problems, especially when you don't ask the locals if they mind visitors. According to the sagas, Leif and his crew spent a winter in Vinland, building huts and gathering valuable resources. They found self-growing wheat, vast forests, and enough fish to feed a saga's worth of warriors. It wasn't just a discovery, it was a solution. Greenland was cold, barren, and isolated. Vinland was temperate and overflowing with potential, but Leif didn't colonize it. He didn't claim it in the name of the king, didn't build a church, and didn't bring a second shipload of settlers. He simply returned to Greenland with a cargo hold full of timber, a story no one could believe was real. Why? The sagas don't say much, but what came next suggests that Leif knew Vinland wasn't empty. Later Norse expeditions led by his brother Thorvald, his sister Freydis, and others would find themselves in violent clashes with the indigenous peoples they called Skrælings. Who these people were is still debated, likely ancestors of modern-day Mi'kmaq, Beothuk, or Inuit. What's clear is that they weren't thrilled about heavily armed strangers showing up with axes and entitlement. Though Leif's expedition saw no bloodshed, he may have sensed that this land was not theirs to take. He didn't attempt conquest. He didn't burn villages. He didn't leave behind a trail of corpses and churches. Instead, he left quietly. Vinland's promise will haunt Norse memory for generations, a land so close, so abundant, yet untouchable. Later voyages would try to settle it, but the tension with the native peoples, the sheer distance from support, and the dangers of overextending meant the idea never stuck in the end. Leif's discovery was too early. The Norse world wasn't ready. The ocean was too vast, the politics too fragile, and the settlers too few. Vinland faded into legend, part Eden, part ghost. And Leif? He returned to Greenland not as a conqueror, but as a man who had seen something no one else had. A world waiting, just not for them, when Leif Erikson returned from Vinland. He didn't come home with gold or glory. He brought something far more controversial, Christianity. Back in Norway, Leif had been baptized under the orders of King Olaf Tryggvason, who saw the sword and the cross as equally valid tools for nation building. Leif had accepted the new faith quietly, thoughtfully, without theatrics. But now with a royal commission and a ship full of priests, he arrived in Greenland as both explorer and evangelist. Greenland, however, had not changed in his absence. The colony was still dominated by Norse paganism. The people still carved runes, drank to Odin, and muttered prayers to Thor during snowstorms. They were settlers, survivors, pragmatic and fiercely traditional, and they were deeply suspicious of a religion that said all their gods were false, and that drinking blood at the winter solstice might be frowned upon. Leif didn't storm temples or burn idols. That wasn't his style. Instead, he used diplomacy, generosity, and the weight of royal backing. He built a church, reportedly the first in Greenland. He gave shelter to priests. He spoke to chiefs, and he told stories not just of Christ, but of a gentler world beyond ice and exile. His own mother, Theodhile, converted and built a chapel of her own. His father, Eric the Red, famously refused. Eric wanted nothing to do with this new god who didn't enjoy a good blood sacrifice and didn't even fight with a hammer. For Eric, Christianity was weakness. For Leif, it was a path forward. This divide within the family mirrored the larger split in Greenland. Some embraced the faith, seeing it as progress, protection, or just another way to curry favor with the king. Others rejected it as foreign noise. Converts and traditionalists shared stew and suspicion in equal measure. Leif didn't force change, he simply embodied it. He lived as both a Norseman and a Christian, a seafarer and a settler. His quiet strength made him a symbol, not just of faith, but a balance of evolution without erasure. He didn't kill the old gods, he just stopped calling on them. And for a colony on the edge of the world, his example was enough to plant the seeds of something new, even if it took generations to grow. Leif Erikson may have carved his own legend across the North Atlantic, but he did so under a long, blood-stained shadow. His father Eric, the Red, wasn't just infamous. He was practically mythological. A brawler, a settler, a man exiled from Norway and Iceland, who then founded Greenland just to have somewhere new to get kicked out of. Wherever he went, lawmen cringed and neighbors kept axes close. His temper was legendary, his charisma even more so. And for Leif, growing up in Eric's household meant learning to balance on a knife's edge between boldness and recklessness, leadership and lunacy. Where Eric was fire, Leif was frost. He didn't bellow. He didn't threaten. But people followed him anyway. The Greenlanders respected his calm. He didn't conquer with a blade, but with direction, and that may have been exactly what the colony needed. But the comparison never faded. Leif returned from Vineland, not drenched in gold, but with timber and tales. His Christian mission in Greenland spread slowly while Eric sulked and scoffed. The old man had wanted a warrior's son to continue his brutal legacy. Instead, he got an explorer, a believer, one who used diplomacy more than steel. Some saw that as weakness. Others saw it as wisdom. Leif didn't care. He wasn't trying to outshine Eric. He was simply surviving him. When Eric the Red died, some say from illness, others claim it was a slow defeat of spirit. It marked the end of a certain kind of Norseman. Eric represented the world of old gods, exile and explosive pride. Leif represented something else, a future that looked beyond icy fjords and blood feuds. In the sagas, their relationship feels strained. Eric resents Leif's new faith. Leif tries to convert him, neither bends, but there's an undercurrent of respect, even admiration. Eric knew his son wasn't like him, and perhaps deep down, he was glad for it. Leif never became king. He never ruled with force. But he outlived his father, spiritually and historically. He led Greenland into a new chapter. Less dramatic, maybe, but more sustainable. And sometimes greatness isn't about slaying your father's demons. Sometimes it's about refusing to inherit them. After Vinland, after the church building, after Eric the Red was gone, Leif Erikson didn't chase more glory. He didn't mount a second expedition or try to conquer new lands. Instead, he did something thoroughly un-Viking. He stayed home. For the rest of his life, Leif lived in Brattahlid, Greenland, a settlement his father had built. But where Eric ruled with raw authority, Leif governed with a calmer hand. He became chief, yes, but more than that, he became a symbol, not of violence, but of continuity, of quiet leadership in a world that was beginning to change. We don't know much about these later years. The sagas grow vague. His name fades from dramatic action and instead lingers as a presence, respected, remembered, but no longer the center of the storm. He raised a family. His son, Thorkel Leifson, would one day lead Greenland. Christianity spread slowly but steadily. The colony endured. But Vineland, the place that should have changed everything, didn't. Others tried to follow in his wake. His brother Thorvald sailed west and was killed by native resistance. His sister Freydis mounted an expedition filled with treachery, axe murders, and bad decisions. Every attempt to settle Vinland failed, not because the land was lacking, but because the Norse world wasn't ready. Distance, hostility, limited support. Leif knew the risks. That's why he didn't return. He had proven the voyage could be made. He had seen what lay beyond the sea. But he also knew Greenland needed stability more than it needed heroics. In time, Vinland became a legend. Half memory, half dream. Some believed it, others didn't. But Leif never shouted his discovery from mountaintops. He never demanded recognition or asked for songs. He didn't need them because he understood something rare. Sometimes making history means knowing when to step back. His final days were likely spent watching the sea, remembering the voyage no one thought possible. And as far as we know, he died in Greenland. Quietly, peacefully. Not on a battlefield, not on a ship. Just at home. Leif Erikson, the explorer who went farther than any Norseman before him, ended his life not chasing the horizon, but anchoring others to it. Leif Erikson may have lived a quiet life in the end, but his story didn't die with him. It mutated, traveled, and multiplied, carried not by historians, but by storytellers. And storytellers, as we know, have a loose relationship with facts. The primary sources for Leif's life, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, were written 2 centuries after he lived. That's like trying to write a biography of Napoleon based on your great-great-grandfather's fishing stories. They're dramatic, rich with detail, and suspiciously convenient. One saga paints Leif as a kind of Viking missionary, spreading Christianity with the calm of a Norcist tea. Another shows him as a daring explorer who stumbles into North America because he got lost. Others add side quests, omens, prophetic dreams, whatever made the tale more interesting over Ailey. And then there's Fridas, his sister, sometimes described as a fierce warrior woman who chased off attackers while heavily pregnant, screaming and slapping a sword across her bare chest. Is it true? Possibly not. But would you want to fight her? Definitely not. What's fascinating is how the sagas twist truth and legend into a braid you can't untangle. Leif didn't boast, but his story grew louder with every telling. Over time, he became a symbol of adventure, faith, resilience, a Norseman who dared to sail W before anyone thought it mattered. And then he disappeared again, buried beneath centuries of dust, outshone by louder, bloodier names. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that Leif reemerged, resurrected by historians eager to find a European who reached America before Columbus. Suddenly, statues appeared. Streets were named. A National Leif Erikson Day was declared in the United States, October 9, based on nothing except immigration paperwork. Ironically, Leif would have hated all the attention. He wasn't seeking fame. He wasn't planting flags. He was doing what Norsemen had always done, sailing into the unknown and bringing back what he could. But history had other plans. And now the quiet Greenlander who left no books, no speeches, no boasts, is remembered as the man who discovered a continent, even if he never claimed it. Leif Erikson never built an empire. He didn't fight in grand battles. He didn't rule a kingdom or crown himself in gold. And yet, he endures not because he demanded a place in history, but because he quietly earned it. While others chased fame through fire and blood, Leif sailed W into the unknown, guided by curiosity, not conquest. He didn't name himself hero or ST. He didn't erect monuments. He didn't even try to hold the land he found. He simply went, saw, and returned a rare kind of explorer, who didn't need the world to remember his name to justify his journey. And still, it did. Leif's legacy lives in stories, in sagas whispered across centuries, reshaped by bards and chroniclers, poets and politicians. The boy from Greenland became a symbol of exploration, resilience, and quiet strength. His journey to Vinland became a chapter in the larger Norse epic, a civilization that dared to sail past the edge of the known world, looking not for war, but for possibility. In the modern age, Leif has taken on a new life. Statues of him stand in Boston, Seattle, Trondheim, and Reykjavik. He's depicted as a proud Norseman gazing westward, and shielding his brow as if still scanning the horizon for that faint tree-lined shore. Schools bear his name. So do ships. And every October 9th, a few people in America even remember he beat Columbus to the punch by nearly 500 years. But perhaps his greatest legacy isn't about discovery or distance. It's about balance. He stood between two worlds, paganism and Christianity, chaos and order, the old gods and a new faith. He didn't force change. He embodied it. He led without shouting. He converted without crusading. He showed that courage isn't always loud, and that history sometimes favors those who simply do the right thing and sail home quietly. Leif Erikson never asked to be remembered. But in a world that often confuses noise for greatness, his story reminds us that legends aren't always forged in fire.